Hey there, night owls. Tonight we're talking about the most powerful love story of the 19th century, and I'm not talking about some romance novel. I'm talking about Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. The woman who ruled a quarter of the planet and the German prince everyone thought was way beneath her. A relationship that started with her proposing to him, because when you're queen, that's how it works, and ended with 40 years of mourning that changed an empire forever. Before we dive in, hit that like button if you're ready for some royal drama that puts modern celebrity couples to shame, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? London? New York? Somewhere halfway across the globe where it's 3 a.m. and you can't sleep? I want to know. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's unpack the greatest love story ever told about two people who were never supposed to fall in love in the first place. This is about to get emotional. Ready? Let's go! So here's the thing about being born into royalty in the early 1800s. You'd think it would be all champagne wishes and caviar dreams, right? Unlimited wealth, servants waiting on you hand and foot, the finest education money could buy. But for our two main characters tonight, being born with royal blood was less like winning the lottery and more like being sentenced to the world's most elegant prison. And trust me, both of them would have traded places with a regular kid in a heartbeat if anyone had bothered to ask. Let's start with Victoria, because her story is the kind of childhood that makes you grateful for whatever family drama you're currently dealing with. Born in 1819 at Kensington Palace, this tiny girl had the misfortune of being third in line to the British throne. Now, you might be thinking third place sounds pretty good, but here's the problem with being third. You're close enough to the throne that people take you very seriously, but far enough away that nobody's quite sure what to do with you. So they did what any reasonable group of paranoid adults would do. They locked her up. I'm not speaking metaphorically here. Victoria spent her entire childhood confined to Kensington Palace, under what her mother and her mother's advisor, a charming gentleman named John Conroy, called the Kensington system. If that sounds like some kind of progressive educational philosophy, let me disabuse you of that notion immediately. The Kensington system was basically house arrest with better furniture. The idea, allegedly, was to keep young Victoria safe, pure, and most importantly controllable. Because nothing says healthy child development quite like total isolation from the outside world. Victoria wasn't allowed to have friends her own age. Not even one. Every person she interacted with was carefully vetted by her mother and Conroy, and most of those people were considerably older than her. Imagine being 8 years old and your only companions are middle-aged ladies in waiting who curtsy every time you enter a room. Not exactly the playdate situation most kids dream about. She couldn't go anywhere without supervision. She couldn't make any decisions on her own. And here's the real kicker, the detail that really drives home just how controlling the system was. Victoria slept in her mother's bedroom every single night until she turned 18 years old. 18. That's not a typo. Think about that for a second. Most of us are fighting for our own rooms by age 10, maybe sneaking out by 16, definitely establishing some kind of independence by 18. Victoria was a legal adult, third in line to rule the greatest empire on earth, and she still had to share a bedroom with her mother like she was a toddler who might wander off in the night. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. As long as Victoria never had a moment alone, as long as every conversation was monitored and every activity was supervised, her mother and Conroy could maintain their iron grip on the future queen. Their plan was simple. Keep her isolated, keep her dependent, and when she finally became queen, they'd be the ones actually running the show while Victoria played the role of grateful puppet. There was just one tiny problem with this plan. Victoria hated every second of it. And unlike most children who might internalize their frustration and become withdrawn, Victoria developed a personality that was about as subtle as a brick through a window. She became stubborn. Not regular stubborn, royal-level stubborn, the kind of stubborn that makes mules look flexible. When she didn't like something, everyone in a 3-room radius knew about it. She developed a temper that could clear a room faster than someone announcing they had the plague. Palace servants learned to read the warning signs, that particular set to her jaw, that dangerous gleam in her eye, and they'd quietly excuse themselves before the storm hit. This wasn't just teenage rebellion, though there was certainly some of that mixed in. This was a defense mechanism, a way of asserting what little control she had over her own life. If she couldn't choose her friends or her activities or even have her own bedroom, she could at least choose to make everyone around her absolutely miserable, when they pushed too hard. It wasn't healthy, it wasn't productive, but it was all she had. Every argument with her mother, every refusal to cooperate with Conroy's schemes, every explosive outburst was Victoria's way of saying, "I'm still here, I still exist, you haven't completely erased me yet." She built walls around herself made of anger and stubbornness, because that was the only architecture available to a girl who had no other building materials. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, wasn't winning any parenting awards either, unfortunately. To be fair to the Duchess, she was in a difficult position herself. Widowed when Victoria was just 8 months old, she was a German princess in a foreign country with one job: raise the heir to the British throne. But instead of building a relationship with her daughter based on trust and affection, she chose to align herself completely with John Conroy, who saw Victoria as his ticket to power and fortune. The Duchess bought into Conroy's system completely, convincing herself that this suffocating control was for Victoria's own good. Mothers have been making that particular rationalization since the dawn of time, but rarely with such spectacular consequences. The relationship between Victoria and her mother became toxic in ways that would make modern family therapists write entire textbooks. They lived in the same palace, shared the same bedroom, and yet there was a chasm between them that might as well have been an ocean. Victoria knew her mother valued Conroy's opinion more than her daughter's happiness. She knew that every tender moment, every motherly gesture came with strings attached and ulterior motives. So she stopped trusting her mother entirely, stopped confiding in her, stopped seeking her approval. By the time Victoria was a teenager, they were essentially hostile roommates who happened to be related by blood. Not exactly the Hallmark card version of royal family life. Now let's shift our attention about 900 miles east to a tiny German duchy called Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. If you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. Most people in 1819 hadn't heard of it either. This was not a major European power. This was the kind of place that made other small German states feel better about themselves. It was so insignificant that King George IV of Britain, Victoria's uncle, once referred to it as that absurd little duchy, which is pretty harsh when you remember that George IV was not exactly known for his own stellar reputation. But this absurd little duchy was home to Prince Albert, born in August 1819, just 3 months after Victoria entered the world. On the surface, Albert's childhood looked like it should have been idyllic. He lived in a castle, Rosenau, which sounds romantic enough. He had a loving father, Duke Ernst, and a beautiful mother, Duchess Louise. He had a brother, Ernst, just 1 year older, who was his constant companion. They had gardens to play in, forests to explore, tutors to educate them. If you were writing a fairy tale, this would be the wholesome German countryside beginning where everyone's rosy-cheeked and happy. But this wasn't a fairy tale. This was real life, and real life in the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha household was about to become a nightmare. Albert was only 5 years old when his world fell apart. His mother, Duchess Louise, was accused of having an affair with an army officer. Now, whether she actually had the affair is something historians still debate, but in aristocratic circles in the 1820s, the accusation alone was enough to destroy someone. There would be no trial, no chance to defend herself, no opportunity for reconciliation. The rules were simple and brutal. A noble woman accused of infidelity was finished, done, completely ruined. Duke Ernst filed for divorce immediately, which in itself was scandalous enough that it became gossip across all the German courts. But here's where it gets truly heartbreaking. Duchess Louise wasn't just divorced and disgraced, she was exiled. Removed completely from her children's lives, banished from the duchy. 5-year-old Albert and his 6-year-old brother Ernst were told that their mother was gone, and they were not allowed to see her, write to her, or even speak her name in their father's presence. Imagine being a small child and having your mother just vanish one day, and everyone in the castle acting like she never existed in the first place. No explanation that a 5-year-old could understand. No gradual transition. Just there one day and gone the next, erased from their lives like she was some kind of embarrassing mistake that needed to be forgotten. Albert never saw his mother again, not when she died of cancer 3 years later at the age of 30. Not ever. He was 8 years old when she died, still a child himself, and he wasn't allowed to attend her funeral or even mourn her publicly, because acknowledging her existence would have been considered inappropriate. The message was clear. His mother had committed an unforgivable sin, and therefore she deserved to be forgotten. Love her? Miss her? Long for her? Those feelings were not acceptable. Those feelings needed to be buried as deeply as she would be buried in her grave. The psychological impact of this kind of childhood trauma is something we understand much better now than they did in the 1820s. Back then, the general attitude was that children were resilient, they'd get over it. Just don't talk about it and everything will be fine. Which is, of course, absolutely not how trauma works. Albert didn't get over it. He couldn't get over it. Instead, he internalized the lesson his father and the court had taught him. Emotions are dangerous. Love makes you vulnerable. If you care too much about someone, they can be taken away from you without warning. The solution, the only safe path forward, was to never let anyone see what you were really feeling. Control your emotions, perfect your behavior, never give anyone ammunition to use against you. So while Victoria was building walls of anger and defiance, Albert was constructing his own fortress of emotional restraint and perfectionism. He became the kind of child who never stepped out of line, who excelled at his studies, who never complained or caused problems. On the surface, he seemed like the model prince, everything a father could want in an heir. But underneath that composed exterior was a boy who had learned far too young that the world was not safe, that people you loved could disappear, and that your only protection was to never let anyone know they had the power to hurt you. He studied obsessively because achievement was something he could control. He followed rules meticulously because perfect behavior meant he couldn't be blamed when things went wrong. He kept his emotions locked away where no one could see them because showing vulnerability had cost his mother everything. The tragedy here is that neither of these children was damaged because of poverty or neglect in the traditional sense. They had roofs over their heads, food on their tables, educations that most people could only dream of. But they were both profoundly alone in ways that had nothing to do with physical isolation. Victoria was surrounded by people every minute of every day, and yet had no one she could truly trust or confide in. Albert had a father and brother and tutors and servants, but he had learned that the people you love most can be ripped away from you by forces beyond your control. They were both royal, they were both privileged, and they were both being systematically damaged by the very systems that were supposed to protect and nurture them. What makes this even more interesting, and what the history books often skip over, is that these traumatic childhoods weren't unusual for royalty in this era. This was just how things were done. Children were political pawns first and actual human beings second. Love was suspicious, affection was weakness, control was everything. Victoria's mother genuinely believed she was doing the right thing with the Kensington system. Albert's father genuinely believed he was protecting his sons and his duchy's reputation by erasing their mother from existence. These weren't cartoon villains twirling their moustaches and plotting evil. They were products of their time, following the accepted rules of aristocratic life, and absolutely destroying their children in the process. But here's what's fascinating about both Victoria and Albert. Despite everything, despite the isolation and the trauma and the toxic family dynamics, they both survived with their core humanity intact. Damaged, yes. Carrying wounds that would never fully heal, absolutely, but not broken, not destroyed. Victoria's stubbornness, which drove everyone around her crazy, would eventually become the iron will that let her rule for 63 years. Albert's emotional control, which seems cold and rigid on the surface, would eventually become the discipline that let him revolutionize the British monarchy and pull off achievements that seemed impossible. The very defense mechanisms they developed to survive their childhoods would become the tools they used to change history. Neither of them knew this yet, of course. In the late 1820s and early 1830s, Victoria was just a miserable teenager trapped in Kensington Palace, counting the days until she could escape her mother's control. Albert was a sensitive young man in Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, studying philosophy and music and trying to find meaning in a world that had taught him not to expect happiness. They had never met. They lived in completely different worlds. The chances that their paths would ever cross seemed minimal at best, except for one small detail. One tiny complication in an otherwise straightforward story of two damaged young aristocrats who would probably live separate lives and die without ever knowing the other existed. Their families were distantly related. Their uncle, Leopold, was actively scheming to marry them to each other. And neither of them had the slightest idea that their carefully constructed walls of self-protection, those elaborate defense mechanisms they'd spent years building, were about to be tested by the one thing neither of them had planned for: each other. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before Victoria and Albert could meet, before they could fall in love or clash or change each other's lives forever, something fairly significant had to happen first. Victoria had to become queen. And the path to that crown, the series of unlikely deaths and accidents that put her on the throne at age 18, is its own kind of fascinating story. Because here's the thing about British succession in the early 1800s. It was chaos. Complete, absolute succession crisis chaos. When Victoria was born in 1819, she was fifth in line to the throne. Her grandfather, King George III, was still technically the king, though he'd been declared insane and locked away years earlier. His eldest son, the Prince Regent, who would become George IV, was next in line. Then came George IV's daughter, Princess Charlotte. Then came a whole complicated mess of younger brothers and their potential heirs. Little baby Victoria was way down the list, so far down that nobody was particularly worried about her succession prospects. She was royal, sure, but she'd probably never be queen. Probably. Then Princess Charlotte died in childbirth in 1817, which sent the entire royal family into a panic. Suddenly there was a succession crisis. George IV's brothers, all of whom were middle-aged and mostly unmarried, realised they needed to produce legitimate heirs immediately. What followed was called the race to the cradle, which sounds charming but was actually a desperate scramble by ageing princes to marry anyone willing and produce babies as quickly as possible. Victoria's father, the Duke of Kent, joined this race enthusiastically. He abandoned his mistress of 28 years, married a German princess he barely knew, and 9 months later Victoria entered the world. He was very proud of himself for this accomplishment. Unfortunately for the Duke of Kent, he died when Victoria was only 8 months old, caught pneumonia after a walk in wet weather, and was gone within days. Which sounds like an absurdly anticlimactic end for someone who'd just completed a crucial dynastic mission. But death in the 1820s was rarely convenient or sensible. So Victoria's father was gone, her mother was left alone in a foreign country with a baby, and that baby suddenly became much more important to the succession than anyone had anticipated. George IV died in 1830 with no legitimate heirs. His brother William IV took the throne. William IV had 10 children, which sounds impressive until you learn they were all illegitimate and therefore couldn't inherit. So the line of succession now looked like this: William IV, who was already in his 60s and not in great health, then Victoria. That's it. Just Victoria between Britain and another succession crisis. No pressure or anything for a teenage girl who still had to share a bedroom with her mother. William IV lived longer than anyone expected, which was good for the country, but increasingly awkward for Victoria and her mother. The Duchess of Kent assumed William would die while Victoria was still a minor, which meant the Duchess would become regent and have all the power. But William hung on stubbornly, partly because he hated the Duchess of Kent and was determined to live long enough that Victoria could inherit as an adult. Royal family dynamics were complicated even then, apparently. Personal spite as a motivation for longevity is not something you find in most history books, but it absolutely played a role here. Victoria spent these years in an increasingly tense situation. She knew she'd probably be queen soon. Everyone knew she'd probably be queen soon. But her mother and Conroy were still operating under the Kensington system, still controlling every aspect of her life, still treating her like a child who couldn't be trusted to think for herself. The difference was that now Victoria was 17, 18, fully aware that she was about to inherit absolute power and absolutely done with being controlled. The fights between Victoria and her mother during this period were legendary. Screaming matches that the entire palace staff pretended not to hear, diplomatic visits where Victoria would sit in stony silence while her mother tried to speak for her, a household that was basically one large powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came on June 20th, 1837, at 6 in the morning. Victoria woke up, still in her mother's bedroom like always, to be told that William IV had died during the night. She was queen. 18 years old, barely an adult by modern standards, and suddenly the most powerful person in the British Empire. The first thing she did, according to historical accounts, was ask for an hour alone in her room, not to cry or celebrate or panic. Just to be alone. For the first time in her entire life, Victoria had a room to herself. She was queen, and that meant nobody could stop her from closing a door. The second thing she did was separate herself completely from her mother. Moved the Duchess to a different part of the palace. Banished John Conroy from her presence forever. Took control of her own household, her own schedule, her own life. After 18 years of the Kensington system, Victoria dismantled it in about 48 hours. The girl who'd been controlled her entire life suddenly had absolute power, and she used it to make sure she would never be controlled again. You can imagine how well her mother took that. So that's where we are in the story. Victoria is queen, living alone for the first time, absolutely determined to rule without interference from the people who made her childhood miserable. She's stubborn, quick-tempered, deeply distrustful of most people around her, and carrying enough emotional baggage to fill several royal carriages. Meanwhile, 900 miles away in Germany, Albert is finishing his education, studying at the University of Bonn, completely unaware that his uncle Leopold has been planning his marriage to his cousin Victoria since they were children. Albert knows about Victoria, of course. They'd met briefly when they were teenagers, an awkward family visit that neither of them particularly enjoyed. But marriage to the Queen of England, that seemed unlikely at best. And here's where the story gets interesting, where two people with matching childhood trauma and completely incompatible coping mechanisms are about to be pushed together by family ambition and political convenience. Victoria, who built walls of anger and stubbornness to protect herself from being controlled. Albert, who built walls of emotional restraint and perfectionism to protect himself from ever being vulnerable again. Both of them damaged. Both of them lonely. Both of them absolutely convinced they didn't need anyone else to be complete. Spoiler alert, they were both wrong about that last part. But recognizing that would take time, conflict, and a lot of extremely awkward conversations. Because here's the thing about two people who have spent their entire lives building elaborate emotional fortresses to protect themselves. When they finally meet, when they're forced to interact, when they start to realize they might actually need each other, those fortresses don't just disappear, they collide, and the collision is rarely gentle. The interesting thing, the detail that makes this story more than just another royal marriage, is that both Victoria and Albert came from places of profound loneliness, but their loneliness looked completely different. Victoria was lonely in a crowd, surrounded by people who monitored her every move but never truly saw her as a person. Albert was lonely in his own head, surrounded by people who seemed kind enough but could never replace the mother who had vanished when he needed her most. Victoria's response was to push back, to fight, to make sure everyone knew she existed even if they hated her for it. Albert's response was to retreat, to perfect himself, to become so controlled and proper that no one could find fault with him. Both strategies worked, in their own way. Both strategies also guaranteed that genuine connection with another person would be nearly impossible. How do you get close to someone who explodes with anger whenever they feel threatened? How do you get close to someone who has trained themselves not to show emotion under any circumstances? The answer is, you don't. Not easily, not quickly. Not without a lot of pain and misunderstanding and fights that make everyone in the palace uncomfortable. But that's the next chapter of this story. The meeting. The courtship, if you can even call it that. The moment when Queen Victoria, who had the power to command armies and make laws, had to ask a German prince to marry her because that's what protocol demanded. The moment when Albert, who had spent his entire life trying to avoid vulnerability, had to decide whether to trust this volatile, powerful, deeply wounded young woman with his carefully guarded heart. The moment when two people who seemed absolutely wrong for each other started to realize they might be exactly what the other needed. We're going to get to all of that. But first, you need to understand where they came from. The Kensington system. The exiled mother. The loneliness that shaped them. The walls they built. Because without understanding their childhoods, without seeing them as two damaged kids trying to survive impossible situations, the rest of the story doesn't make sense. Their love story wasn't love at first sight. It was two wounded people slowly learning to trust each other, despite every instinct telling them to run the other direction. That's what makes it remarkable. Not that they fell in love, but that they managed to overcome everything their childhoods had taught them in order to let someone else in. And here's the final thing to remember as we move forward into the actual relationship between Victoria and Albert. The trauma they carried from childhood never completely disappeared. Victoria would struggle with her temper for her entire life. Albert would struggle with his inability to be emotionally vulnerable for his entire life. These weren't problems that love solved instantly. Love didn't heal their wounds. Love didn't erase their pasts. What love did was give them a partner who understood, who had their own scars, who could hold space for all that damage without running away. That's not the fairy tale version of romance. That's real. That's messy. That's complicated. That's what we're about to explore. So now you know where they started. Two lonely kids in golden cages, learning all the wrong lessons about love and trust and vulnerability. Two young adults carrying invisible scars that would shape every relationship they'd ever have. Two people who should have been completely incompatible, who had every reason to fail spectacularly when they finally met. The fact that they didn't fail, that they actually managed to build something remarkable together, is the story we're going to tell. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't smooth. And it definitely wasn't what anyone expected, least of all Victoria and Albert themselves. Now, before we get to the grand romance that everyone remembers, we need to talk about their first meeting. Because, spoiler alert, it was not love at first sight. It wasn't even particularly like at first sight. It was more like vague, polite tolerance at first sight, which is honestly a much more realistic beginning to a relationship but makes for terrible romance novels. The year was 1836. Victoria was 17, still trapped in the Kensington system, still sharing a bedroom with her mother, still counting down the days until she could escape. Her uncle Leopold, who was now King of Belgium and apparently had nothing better to do than meddle in his relatives' love lives, decided it was time for Victoria to meet some suitable young men, specifically her cousins from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Albert and his older brother Ernst. Leopold had been planning this match since Victoria and Albert were children, which sounds romantic until you remember that arranged marriages based on family politics were basically the Tinder of the aristocratic world. Swipe right on strategic alliances, swipe left on personal compatibility. Albert was 17, same age as Victoria, and absolutely did not want to make this trip. He was perfectly happy in Germany, thank you very much, studying at university and pursuing his interests in philosophy and music. The last thing he wanted was to be paraded in front of his cousin like some kind of prize stallion at a fair. But his father and Uncle Leopold insisted, so off he went to England with his brother, probably wondering what he'd done to deserve this particular punishment. The journey was rough. The Channel crossing made him violently seasick, and by the time he arrived at Kensington Palace he looked, according to Victoria's own account, extremely pale and tired. Not exactly the dashing prince entrance anyone was hoping for. Victoria, for her part, was not impressed. She wrote in her diary that Albert was handsome enough, which is the kind of faint praise that would get you blocked on a dating app today. She found him too serious, too formal, too German. He went to bed early every evening because he was still recovering from the journey, and probably because spending time with Victoria's mother and her controlling household was exhausting. Victoria noted this in her diary with what can only be described as mild disdain. She preferred his brother Ernst, who was more outgoing and fun and didn't treat social occasions like they were academic seminars. The visit lasted a few weeks and then the brothers went home, probably relieved to escape. Uncle Leopold's grand matchmaking scheme appeared to have failed spectacularly. But here's what makes this first meeting fascinating from a historical perspective. The reason Victoria and Albert didn't immediately fall for each other wasn't because they were incompatible. It was because they were products of completely different worlds, and neither of them understood the language the other was speaking. Victoria had been raised in the British court system, which was all about practicality, protocol, and reading the room. She'd learned to navigate complex social situations, to understand political undercurrents, to know when to push and when to retreat. Her education was designed to make her a functional monarch, not a philosopher. She could speak several languages, but her real skill was speaking power. Albert, on the other hand, had been raised in the German intellectual tradition, which was having something of a golden age in the early 19th century. This was the era of Goethe and Schiller, of Kant and Hegel, of the idea that education and moral improvement could perfect both individuals and society. Small German courts like Saxe-Coburg-Gotha couldn't compete with Britain militarily or economically, so they competed intellectually instead. They produced philosophers, composers, scientists, artists. It was their way of mattering on the European stage, proving they were more than just tiny territories that larger powers could absorb at will. Albert absorbed all of this. He studied philosophy seriously. He believed in progress, in the power of education, in the idea that society could be rationally improved through thoughtful reform. So when these two teenagers met in 1836, they weren't just two people from different countries. They represented two completely different approaches to what monarchy should be. Victoria saw herself as the head of a political system that required careful navigation and compromise. Albert saw himself as a potential force for moral and social improvement. Victoria was trained to ask what works. Albert was trained to ask what's right. Victoria understood power as something you wielded through relationships and political savvy. Albert understood power as something you earned through merit and moral authority. These are not easily compatible worldviews, especially when you're both 17 and neither of you has enough life experience to realise that you're both right about different things. The cultural gap went deeper than just philosophy and education. British court life in the 1830s was, to put it charitably, kind of a mess. The previous kings, George IV and William IV, had not exactly set high standards for royal behaviour. George IV had been more interested in architecture and mistresses than governance. William IV was a former naval officer who cursed like a sailor and treated court protocol like it was optional. The British aristocracy was wealthy and powerful, but it was also notoriously decadent, corrupt, and more focused on their own privileges than on any grand vision of social improvement. The general attitude was, if it's not broken too badly, why fix it? And if it is broken, well, someone else will probably handle it eventually. German courts were different. Not better, necessarily, but different. They had less money and less power, which meant they couldn't afford to be quite as frivolous. They took their role as cultural and intellectual leaders seriously, because that was one of the few roles available to them. A German prince like Albert was expected to be educated, cultured, morally upright, and genuinely interested in the welfare of his subjects, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because his duchy was small enough that his subjects actually mattered individually. If you're ruling millions of people scattered across a globe-spanning empire, you can afford to think of them as abstract numbers. If you're ruling a duchy where you might actually run into your subjects at the market, you need to have a better relationship with them. This created a fundamental difference in how Victoria and Albert approached basically everything. When Victoria looked at a problem, she thought about how to manage it politically, who needed to be consulted, what the public opinion would be, how it would affect her relationship with Parliament. It was chess, basically. Very sophisticated chess with lives at stake, but chess nonetheless. When Albert looked at a problem, he thought about what the ideal solution would be, what reforms would address the root cause, what educational or social changes would prevent it from happening again. He wanted to fix things. Victoria wanted to manage things. These are both valuable skills, but they lead to very different strategies and a lot of arguments about which approach is better. Neither of them understood this in 1836, of course. They just knew they didn't particularly like each other and were both relieved when the visit ended. Victoria went back to her miserable existence in Kensington Palace, and Albert went back to Germany, probably thinking he'd dodged a bullet. Uncle Leopold was disappointed, but he wasn't giving up on his matchmaking plans just yet. He was patient. He could wait. Fortunately for him, and unfortunately for Victoria and Albert's attempts to avoid each other, events were about to take a turn that would change everything. On June 20th, 1837, William IV died, and Victoria became Queen. She was 18 years old, legally an adult by exactly 1 month, which meant no regency and no need for her mother to have any official power. Victoria moved out of her mother's bedroom, banished John Conroy, and for the first time in her life experienced what it felt like to have control over her own existence. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. It was absolutely overwhelming. And into this chaos walked Lord Melbourne. William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne, was Victoria's first Prime Minister, and to understand the next 3 years of Victoria's life, you need to understand just how much influence this man had over her. He was 58 years old when Victoria became Queen. She was 18. He was sophisticated, charming, witty, politically savvy, and exactly the kind of paternal figure that Victoria had never had in her life. Her actual father had died when she was a baby. Her uncle Leopold was far away in Belgium. John Conroy had been controlling and manipulative, not supportive. Victoria latched onto Melbourne immediately and completely. Melbourne, for his part, was delighted by Victoria. She was young, enthusiastic, eager to learn, and gave him a level of influence he'd never enjoyed with previous monarchs. He spent hours with her every day, teaching her about politics, explaining how Parliament worked, gossiping about other politicians, basically becoming her entire world outside of official duties. They had dinner together almost every evening. They laughed at the same jokes. Victoria wrote in her diary that he was like a father to her, which should have been sweet but was actually kind of concerning given how dependent she became on his approval. This is where things get psychologically interesting. Victoria had just escaped one controlling relationship with her mother and Conroy, only to immediately enter another controlling relationship with Melbourne. The difference was that Melbourne's control felt like freedom because he agreed with her, supported her, and made her feel powerful rather than powerless. He didn't try to manage her the way her mother had. Instead, he taught her how to manage others. It was a much more sophisticated form of influence, and Victoria didn't recognise it as control because it felt so much better than what she'd experienced before. Melbourne also, whether consciously or unconsciously, had a vested interest in keeping Victoria single. As long as she was unmarried and relying on him for advice, he was effectively the second most powerful person in Britain. The moment she married, her husband would become her primary advisor, and Melbourne would be relegated to a more traditional Prime Minister role. He never said this directly, of course. He would never openly discourage Victoria from marrying. But he did make it very clear that she was doing fine on her own, that she didn't need to rush into marriage, that she should enjoy being queen for a while before taking on the additional complications of a husband and family. Victoria enthusiastically agreed with this assessment. She was having the time of her life being queen. She could stay up late at balls and parties. She could ride horses whenever she wanted. She could make decisions without asking permission. She had escaped the Kensington system, and the last thing she wanted was to trap herself in a marriage that might recreate that same dynamic of control and manipulation. In her mind, getting married meant giving up her independence and her power. So she put off the entire question of marriage, despite the fact that everyone around her kept bringing it up, including her mother, who desperately wanted Victoria to marry someone, anyone, preferably someone who would restore the Duchess of Kent's influence, and Uncle Leopold, who kept writing letters about how wonderful Albert was and how perfect he would be as her husband. The problem for Leopold was that Victoria's memory of Albert was not exactly glowing. She remembered a pale, serious young man who went to bed early and seemed more interested in books than people. She was 19, then 20, then 21, busy ruling an empire and enjoying her independence. Why would she want to marry someone boring? Her mother kept suggesting other options. There was Prince Alexander of the Netherlands, though that match had obvious political complications. There were various German princes, though Victoria had developed a certain scepticism about German princes in general after meeting Albert. Every time someone suggested a possible husband, Victoria would change the subject or make it clear she wasn't interested. What's fascinating about this period is that everyone around Victoria was engaged in a battle for influence, and Victoria was the prize. Her mother and Conroy still wanted to control her. Melbourne wanted to maintain his influence. Various European courts wanted to secure an alliance through marriage. The British aristocracy had their own preferences about who the Queen should marry, usually someone who would protect their interests. Uncle Leopold wanted Albert to marry Victoria both for family reasons and because he genuinely believed they'd be good for each other, though his motives weren't entirely pure either. Everyone had an agenda. Everyone was manipulating. And Victoria was in the middle of all of it, trying to figure out who she could actually trust. The interesting thing is that this constant political pressure actually worked in Albert's favour, though neither he nor Victoria realised it at the time. Every time someone tried to push Victoria toward a particular marriage choice, she pushed back harder. Every time her mother suggested a prince, Victoria immediately decided that Prince was unsuitable. Every time a European court made overtures about a possible match, Victoria felt her autonomy was being threatened. She was the Queen. She had the power. And she was determined that if she ever did marry, it would be her choice, not something forced on her by political convenience or family pressure. Meanwhile, Albert was in Germany, completely unaware that he was even still in the running for Victoria's hand. He'd gone back to his studies after the 1836 visit, and as far as he knew, that was the end of it. His cousin Victoria clearly wasn't interested, and honestly he wasn't particularly interested either. He had his own life to live, his own interests to pursue. He studied at the University of Bonn, travelled through Italy, continued his education in music and art and philosophy. He was in no hurry to get married, and certainly not to someone who had seemed unimpressed by him the one time they'd met. But Uncle Leopold was persistent. He kept writing to both Victoria and Albert, subtly and then less subtly, suggesting that they should give each other another chance. To Victoria, he emphasised how much Albert had matured, how intelligent and cultured he was, how he would be a true partner rather than just another person trying to control her. To Albert, he emphasised the opportunities that marrying Victoria would provide, not just for personal advancement, but for the ability to influence policy and make real changes in the world. Leopold knew his audience. He knew Victoria wanted independence and partnership. He knew Albert wanted purpose and the ability to make a difference. He positioned the marriage as the solution to both their desires, which was sophisticated manipulation, but manipulation nonetheless. The thing that finally convinced Victoria to invite Albert back for another visit in 1839 wasn't Leopold's letters, though those certainly helped. It was the realization that everyone else was trying to make her marry someone for their benefit, but Albert was the one option that felt like it might actually be her choice. He wasn't being pushed by her mother. He wasn't politically necessary in the way some other matches were. He was just her cousin from Germany, someone Uncle Leopold liked, someone who had no power base in Britain, and therefore couldn't use marriage to dominate her the way she feared. It was a weird kind of logic, but it made sense to Victoria. If she was going to marry someone, it might as well be someone who wouldn't automatically have the support of the British establishment, someone who would be dependent on her for his position, rather than the other way around. So in October 1839, Albert came back to England. He was 20 years old now, 3 years older and considerably more mature than the awkward teenager who'd visited in 1836. The journey was just as miserable. The Channel crossing made him just as seasick. But this time, when he arrived at Windsor Castle and Victoria saw him, something was different. She was different. She was a confident queen now, not a frustrated princess. He was different. He'd filled out, become more comfortable in his own skin, developed the kind of presence that only comes with actual life experience. But more importantly, the circumstances were different. Victoria wasn't looking at Albert as just another potential suitor being forced on her. She was looking at him as someone she had actively chosen to see again. The visit lasted 5 days. 5 days that changed both their lives completely. They talked, really talked, in a way they hadn't managed in 1836. Victoria discovered that Albert was intelligent, thoughtful, passionate about ideas and reform and making the world better. He wasn't boring, he was serious, which turned out to be very different things. He actually cared about the responsibilities that came with his position, which was refreshing after dealing with British aristocrats who mostly cared about their hunting and their estates and their place in the social hierarchy. Albert discovered that Victoria wasn't just a spoiled princess who liked parties. She was sharp, politically savvy, desperately trying to do her job well despite having no real preparation for it. She had a sense of humour that matched his own. She understood duty in a way that most people didn't. On the second day of his visit, Victoria made her decision. On October 15th, 1839, 5 days after Albert's arrival, Victoria called him into her private rooms. This is where it gets interesting from a protocol perspective, because in a normal courtship the man proposes to the woman, but Victoria was queen. She couldn't be proposed to because that would imply someone else had the power to make decisions about her life, so she had to do the proposing. She had to ask Albert to marry her, which she later admitted was one of the most nerve-wracking things she'd ever done. She was the most powerful person in Britain, and she was terrified that this German prince might say no. Albert said yes. Of course he said yes. He would have been insane to say no, both from a practical standpoint and because, despite his reservations about the whole situation, he'd actually developed feelings for Victoria during those 5 days. But his immediate acceptance shouldn't obscure the fact that this was a complicated moment for him. He was agreeing to give up his life in Germany, to move to a foreign country where he didn't speak the language fluently, to take on a role that had no defined responsibilities or constitutional authority. He would be the husband of the Queen, but what did that actually mean? Nobody knew. There was no job description for Prince Consort. He was walking into a complete unknown, trusting that Victoria would make space for him in her life and her work, hoping that he could find some purpose beyond just being decorative. The engagement was announced and the reaction was mixed, to put it mildly. The British public was generally pleased. Victoria seemed happy, and a young queen in love was good for the monarchy's image. But the British aristocracy was suspicious. Who was this German prince? What did he want? Was he going to try to influence British policy? The press was even worse. Several newspapers published unflattering articles about Albert, questioning his motives, suggesting he was a fortune hunter, mocking his German background. Parliament debated his allowance and his title, and both debates became ugly. They cut his requested funding by half and refused to give him the title of King Consort or even Prince Consort initially. The message was clear. You're not British, you're not really one of us, and we're going to make sure you know your place. Albert was hurt and angry about this reception, understandably. He'd left his home, his family, his entire life to marry Victoria, and he was being treated like an unwelcome intruder. Victoria was furious on his behalf, but there wasn't much she could do. Parliament controlled the money, and even a queen couldn't override parliamentary decisions without causing a constitutional crisis. So Albert arrived in England in February 1840 with a smaller income than expected, no official title, and a hostile aristocracy. Not exactly the warm welcome anyone hopes for when starting a new life. The wedding took place on February 10th, 1840, at the Chapel Royal in St James's Palace. It was a relatively small affair by royal standards, just a few hundred guests, though of course those few hundred guests included everyone important in British politics and society. Victoria wore a white wedding dress, which was unusual at the time. Most brides wore their best dress in whatever colour they preferred, often red or blue. But Victoria chose white, and because she was the Queen, and everyone paid attention to what the Queen did, white wedding dresses became fashionable and eventually traditional. So if you've ever wondered why brides wear white, you can thank Victoria, who mostly chose it because she thought it looked nice with the lace she wanted to use. The wedding itself was beautiful according to all accounts. Victoria was radiant. Albert was handsome and nervous. Lord Melbourne reportedly cried during the ceremony, which should tell you something about how much he realised he was losing. The reception was elegant, the cake was enormous, and then Victoria and Albert left for Windsor Castle for what passed for a honeymoon. Victoria had given them exactly 3 days before she needed to be back in London for state business. 3 days. Modern couples take longer honeymoons after destination weddings in Cabo, but Victoria was Queen, and she took her responsibilities seriously. Also, and this is important to understand, she didn't yet grasp that being married might require some adjustment period. In her mind, she was still Queen first and wife second, and being Queen meant getting back to work immediately. This attitude was going to cause problems, significant problems. Because while Victoria thought marriage would be this wonderful addition to her life that wouldn't change her fundamental routine, Albert thought marriage meant partnership, shared decision-making, mutual support in all things including state, business. And the clash between these two expectations, between Victoria's determination to maintain her independence and Albert's assumption that he would have a meaningful role, was about to create some of the most spectacular fights in royal history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. The point of this whole section, the reason we needed to spend time on the cultural clash and the battle for Victoria's heart, and the 3 years between their first meeting and their marriage, is to understand that their relationship didn't start from a place of perfect compatibility. They came from different worlds. They had different assumptions about what marriage should look like. They were both carrying baggage from their childhoods. They were both stubborn. They were both used to being right. And they were about to be forced to figure out how to build a life together while also navigating the impossible situation of being the Queen of England and her German husband in a country that didn't particularly want a German prince hanging around. The fact that they managed to make this work at all is remarkable. The fact that they made it work so well that it became one of the great love stories of the 19th century is almost unbelievable. But it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen easily. It happened through years of arguments and compromises and slow realizations that maybe the other person had a point. It happened because Victoria gradually learned that having a partner didn't mean losing her power, and Albert gradually learned that he could make a difference even without formal authority. It happened because two people from completely different worlds decided that building a bridge between those worlds was worth the effort. That's what makes their story interesting. Not the fairy tale version where they met and fell in love and lived happily ever after. The real version, where they met and weren't particularly impressed, then met again 3 years later and realised they might actually work together, then got married and immediately started fighting about basically everything, and somehow, despite all of that, built something real and lasting. That's the story we're telling, and it gets so much more complicated from here. So picture this. You're a 20-year-old German prince. You've just married the most powerful woman in the world. You've moved to a foreign country where half the aristocracy thinks you're a gold-digging opportunist, and the other half just wishes you'd disappear. Parliament has publicly insulted you by cutting your funding and refusing you any meaningful title. And your wife, who claims to love you desperately, has made it crystal clear that you will have absolutely no role in her actual work as Queen. Welcome to Britain, Albert. Hope you enjoy your stay. The first few years of Victoria and Albert's marriage were, to put it mildly, a complete disaster from Albert's perspective. He'd left everything behind in Germany: his family, his friends, his home, his entire life. He'd done this because he loved Victoria, and because he believed, perhaps naively, that as her husband he would be able to support her work and maybe even make a meaningful contribution to British society. What he discovered instead was that he had accidentally wandered into one of the most humiliating positions any man in the 19th century could occupy. He was the husband of the Queen in a deeply patriarchal society that had no idea what to do with a man who had authority over nothing except his own breakfast menu. Let's start with the constitutional reality, because it's important to understand just how powerless Albert's position actually was. In Britain, the monarch holds constitutional authority. The monarch meets with ministers, reviews state papers, signs legislation, represents the nation. This was Victoria's job, and it was hers alone. Albert wasn't king. He wasn't even Prince Consort initially, just Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which is a mouthful and also makes you sound like a minor character in a European operetta. He had no constitutional role whatsoever. He couldn't attend meetings between Victoria and her ministers. He couldn't read state documents unless Victoria specifically showed them to him. He couldn't even be in the room when important decisions were being made. He was expected to stand there, look decorative, smile at state dinners, and keep his opinions to himself. For a man who had been raised to believe that nobility came with responsibility, this was psychological torture. Victoria, bless her heart, did not help the situation at all in those first years. She loved Albert. She wrote in her diary constantly about how wonderful he was, how handsome, how kind, how perfect. But love and trust are different things, and Victoria had serious trust issues thanks to her childhood under the Kensington system. She'd spent 18 years being controlled by her mother and John Conroy. She'd spent the first 3 years of her reign fighting to maintain her independence against everyone who wanted to manipulate her. She'd married Albert, partly because he seemed like he wouldn't try to dominate her. And then, almost immediately after the wedding, she panicked that maybe he would try to dominate her after all. So she drew a line in the sand. I'm queen, you're not, and you need to accept that. This might have been manageable if Victoria had been subtle about it, but subtlety was not one of Victoria's strengths. She would literally exclude Albert from important conversations. She wouldn't tell him what was happening with government business. She made it clear that Lord Melbourne, her former Prime Minister, who she still adored, had more access to her thoughts and decisions than her own husband did. Can you imagine how that must have felt for Albert? You marry someone, move across Europe to be with them, and then they treat you like you're not quite trustworthy enough to be included in their actual life. That's not a partnership. That's being someone's very well-paid accessory. Albert tried to handle this with his usual emotional control and perfectionism. He didn't complain publicly, he didn't make scenes, he just quietly tried to find ways to make himself useful. He started managing household affairs, which sounds trivial until you realise that the royal household in the 1840s was a bureaucratic nightmare of overlapping responsibilities, ancient traditions that made no sense, and expenditures that would make a modern accountant weep. Nobody had reformed the system in decades because, frankly, nobody important cared enough to bother. Albert cared. He dove into the details, figured out which positions were redundant, which expenses were unnecessary, which traditions could be updated without causing a constitutional crisis. He saved the royal household a significant amount of money, which should have been seen as a triumph, but was mostly met with resentment from the people whose cushy jobs he'd eliminated. He also tried to be supportive of Victoria in the ways he was allowed to be supportive. He would play piano for her in the evenings, because she loved music and it made her happy. He would sketch with her, another shared interest. He would listen to her complaints about various ministers and courtiers, offering advice when she asked for it and staying quiet when she didn't. He was trying desperately to be a good husband within the very narrow confines of what Victoria would allow. But it wasn't enough, and both of them knew it. Albert was miserable. Victoria could see he was miserable, but didn't understand why he couldn't just be content with the life they had. This was a recipe for explosive arguments. and explosive arguments is exactly what they had. The fights between Victoria and Albert in those early years were legendary. Not public, thankfully, because they both understood that royal marital discord was not something you wanted splashed across newspapers, but private, absolutely brutal. They would scream at each other. Victoria would say things she didn't mean because she had a temper and no emotional filter when she was angry. Albert would retreat into cold, cutting precision, which was his way of expressing fury without losing control. Then they'd both storm off to separate parts of the palace and spend hours being miserable and convinced that their marriage was a terrible mistake. The content of these fights varied, but the underlying dynamic was always the same. Albert wanted to be involved in Victoria's work. He wanted to be her partner, her advisor, her equal collaborator. Victoria wanted to be queen without anyone trying to control her, and she interpreted Albert's desire for involvement as an attempt to take her power. She couldn't separate the idea of sharing her work with someone from the idea of being controlled by them. In her mind, letting Albert into her political life meant risking everything she'd fought so hard to achieve when she escaped the Kensington system. So she kept him out. He felt rejected and useless. They fought about it, and the cycle continued. What makes this even more painful is that they both genuinely loved each other. This wasn't a political marriage where they'd given up on emotional connection. They were actually in love, which meant every fight hurt more because they cared so much about each other's approval. Victoria would write in her diary after arguments, agonizing about whether she'd been too harsh, whether she was pushing Albert away, whether she was destroying their marriage. Albert would write letters to his brother in Germany, letters that revealed just how isolated and unhappy he felt in Britain, how he missed his home, how he wasn't sure he could keep living this way. These weren't two people who were incompatible. These were two people who loved each other, but had no idea how to build a functional partnership because their childhoods had given them completely different and incompatible templates for what relationships should look like. Then Victoria got pregnant. This was in late 1840, less than a year after they'd married, and pregnancy changed everything, though not in the way you might expect. Victoria hated being pregnant. This is important to understand because the popular image of Victoria is often as this maternal figure who loved babies and family life. The reality, she thought pregnancy was undignified and uncomfortable. She found babies to be, in her own words, quite disgusting when they're very small. She was terrified of childbirth, which was entirely reasonable given that maternal mortality in the 1840s was horrifying, and even queens died in labour regularly. The whole experience made her anxious and irritable, and even more difficult to deal with than usual. But here's what pregnancy did do. It forced Victoria to realise that she couldn't do everything herself anymore. She felt terrible physically. She couldn't keep up the same schedule of meetings and events. She needed help, and the only person she trusted enough to ask for help was Albert. So, grudgingly at first, she started letting him read state papers. She started asking his opinion on political matters. She started allowing him to handle some of the correspondence and meetings she couldn't manage herself. It was supposed to be temporary, just until the baby was born and she recovered. But once Albert had his foot in the door, he wasn't giving up that ground. Their daughter Victoria, known as Vicky, was born in November 1840. The birth was difficult and frightening, and Victoria later credited Albert with keeping her calm and supporting her through it. After the birth, while Victoria recovered, Albert basically ran the country for a few weeks. He met with ministers. He handled paperwork, he made decisions, and the thing was, he was good at it. Really good. Ministers who had been sceptical of this German interloper started to realise that Albert was intelligent, thorough, and genuinely interested in making things work better. He wasn't trying to steal Victoria's power. He was trying to be useful. That's a very different thing. Victoria recovered, and there was a moment where she could have taken back all the responsibilities she'd temporarily handed to Albert. But she didn't. Because she'd realised something important during those weeks when Albert had been handling state business. She was better at her job when she had a partner, someone she could talk to about difficult decisions. Someone who would give her honest advice without trying to manipulate her towards some personal agenda. Someone who cared about the work as much as she did. Lord Melbourne had filled that role for a while, but Melbourne was getting older and increasingly unreliable. Albert was there, he was capable, and most importantly, he actually understood her in ways that Melbourne never had. This wasn't a sudden transformation into perfect partnership. They still fought, They still had disagreements about how much authority Albert should have. But slowly, grudgingly, Victoria started to let her walls down. She started to trust that Albert wanted to support her rather than control her. She started to see him not as a threat to her power, but as an extension of it. And once that shift happened, once Victoria and Albert started working together instead of against each other, they became formidable. Albert started focusing on areas where he could make real contributions without stepping on Victoria's constitutional authority. He couldn't be king, but he could be a reformer. He couldn't make policy directly, but he could influence it through Victoria. He couldn't command the government, but he could shame them into doing better by showing what was possible. His first major project was something that sounds boring but was actually revolutionary. He decided to modernize the way the royal estates were managed. Most of the royal properties were run inefficiently, with outdated farming methods and no real attention to whether they were actually productive. Albert brought in new agricultural techniques, invested in improvements, turned these estates into models of what modern, efficient land management could look like. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it got people's attention. Then he moved on to education and the arts. He became involved with learned societies, museums, universities. He pushed for better science education, for support for artists and composers, for making culture accessible to more people instead of just the aristocratic elite. He joined the board of the Society for Improving the Condition of the Labouring Classes, which was focused on building better housing for workers. Again, not the kind of thing that gets you headlines, but incredibly important. He was using his position as the Queen's husband to draw attention to causes that would have otherwise been ignored. He couldn't pass laws, but he could use his status to make certain issues impossible to ignore. The British establishment slowly, reluctantly started to respect Albert. Not because they liked Germans any better than before, not because they'd stopped thinking of him as an outsider, but because you can't really argue with results. The man was clearly working harder than most of the aristocrats who'd been born into their positions. He was clearly intelligent and well-informed. He was clearly not trying to grab power for himself, but genuinely interested in making things better. It's hard to hate someone who's doing good work, even if you're predisposed to dislike them. Albert's strategy, whether conscious or not, was brilliant. He couldn't change the fact that he would never be king. He couldn't change the fact that Parliament had denied him formal authority, but he could make himself indispensable through sheer competence and dedication, and that's exactly what he did. The relationship between Victoria and Albert during this period was evolving in interesting ways. They were still having children regularly, which Victoria continued to find unpleasant, but accepted as part of her duty. They were also learning to work together as a team. Victoria would consult Albert on political matters. Albert would advise her on how to handle difficult ministers or navigate tricky situations. They would spend hours going through paperwork together, which sounds tedious but was actually their version of quality time. They were building the partnership that Albert had wanted from the beginning, and that Victoria had been too scared to allow. But the real turning point, the moment when everything clicked into place and Albert went from being the Queen's husband to being one of the most influential people in Britain, was the Great Exhibition of 1851. This was Albert's masterpiece, his grand vision, the project that would define his legacy. And when he first proposed it, absolutely everyone thought he was insane. The idea was simple enough in concept. Host an international exhibition showcasing the industrial and artistic achievements of nations from around the world. Build a massive building to house all the exhibits. Invite everyone to come see what humanity was capable of creating. Promote international cooperation and peaceful competition. Demonstrate that Britain was at the forefront of progress and innovation. Easy, right? Except nothing about this was easy. Nothing about this was remotely simple. And the list of things that could go wrong was approximately 50 miles long. First of all, nobody had ever done anything like this before. There had been smaller exhibitions, but nothing on the scale Albert was imagining. He wanted thousands of exhibits from dozens of countries. He wanted millions of visitors. He wanted this to be the defining event of the decade, a showcase that would be remembered for generations. The scope alone was enough to make people skeptical. Then there was the cost. Who was going to pay for all this? The government didn't want to fund it because governments never want to fund anything that sounds risky and expensive. Private investors were nervous about whether they'd get their money back. Albert ended up having to organise a royal commission and basically beg, borrow and charm his way to enough funding to make it happen. Then there was the question of where to put this hypothetical exhibition. Albert's plan required a massive building, bigger than anything that existed. Someone suggested Hyde Park, one of London's main public parks, which immediately caused an uproar. You're going to build a giant industrial palace in the middle of our park? What if it destroys the trees? What if it becomes a permanent eyesore? What if it attracts the wrong sort of people? The objections were endless, and they would have been insurmountable except for the design that Joseph Paxton proposed. Paxton was a gardener, not an architect, which already tells you this was going to be unconventional. He'd designed greenhouses before, large glass structures that let in light while protecting plants. He looked at the problem of the Hyde Park building and thought, what if we just scale up a greenhouse? What if we build the entire thing out of iron and glass, prefabricated components that could be assembled quickly and, crucially, disassembled after the exhibition was over? This would address the concerns about permanence. It would be spectacular to look at, this gleaming glass palace in the park, and it would be structurally innovative, using modern materials and techniques in ways that had never been done before. Albert loved it. The press immediately started calling it the Crystal Palace, and the name stuck. Building the Crystal Palace was an absolute nightmare of logistics. You're talking about a building that was over 1,800 feet long, covering 19 acres, with over 1 million square feet of glass. This had to be constructed in less than a year, because Albert was committed to opening in May 1851 and would not be pushed back. Hundreds of workers laboured on the site. The glass panes had to be manufactured in unprecedented quantities. The iron framework had to be precise, because if your tolerances are off in a glass building, everything shatters. There were accidents, delays, cost overruns, all the normal construction problems multiplied by the unprecedented scale. And through all of this, Albert was personally involved, checking on progress, solving problems, dealing with the 1,000 small crises that threatened to derail the entire project. Meanwhile, he also had to organise what would actually go inside this building once it was constructed. He needed exhibits from around the world, which meant negotiating with foreign governments and manufacturers. He needed British exhibits that would show off Britain's industrial might without making other countries feel insulted or inferior. He needed a system for organising 13,000 exhibits so that visitors could actually navigate the space without getting hopelessly lost. He needed security, crowd control, facilities for millions of visitors. This wasn't just an exhibition. This was event planning on a scale that would make modern Olympic organisers feel inadequate. And remember, Albert was doing this without any official authority. He was doing this as the Queen's husband, on the force of his personality and ability to convince people that this crazy idea might actually work. The British press was ruthless during the planning stages. They published cartoons mocking the Crystal Palace, predicting it would collapse in the first strong wind or that the opening day would be a catastrophe. They questioned whether foreigners would actually come to Britain for this exhibition, or whether it would be an embarrassing flop. They suggested that Albert was wasting everyone's time and money on a vanity project. Conservative politicians argued that spending money on an exhibition was frivolous when there were serious problems in the country that needed attention. The whole project was controversial enough that Albert's reputation was completely on the line. If the Great Exhibition failed, his credibility would be destroyed. He would go back to being that German prince who had ideas above his station. Everything he'd worked for would be wasted. Victoria, to her credit, supported Albert completely throughout this entire process. She believed in his vision even when almost everyone else was sceptical. She used her influence to smooth over diplomatic problems, to encourage participation from hesitant countries, to defend the project when critics attacked it. This was them working as a true partnership. Albert had the vision and did the organising. Victoria had the authority and used it to make space for Albert's work. Together they were stronger than either of them could have been alone. It only took them 11 years of marriage to figure this out, but better late than never. The Great Exhibition opened on May 1st, 1851, and it was a triumph, an absolute, unqualified triumph. The opening ceremony was spectacular, attended by the royal family and dignitaries from around the world. The Crystal Palace looked exactly as impressive as Albert had hoped, a gleaming structure that seemed to capture light and transform it into something magical. The exhibits inside range from massive industrial machinery to delicate works of art, from the cutting-edge technology of the steam age to traditional crafts from cultures around the globe. There was something for everyone. The Koh-i-Noor diamond drew crowds. The hydraulic press demonstrations amazed visitors. The displays of textiles, ceramics, sculptures, and scientific instruments were overwhelming in their variety and quality. Over the next 5 months, more than 6 million people visited the Great Exhibition. 6 million in a country where the entire population was around 20 million. Working-class families saved up money to take the train to London and spend a day at the Crystal Palace. Foreign visitors came from across Europe and beyond. The exhibition made a profit, which meant all those nervous investors got their money back with interest. It generated enormous goodwill for Britain, showcasing the country as modern, innovative, and open to the world. It established Albert as a visionary, someone who could see possibilities that others missed and had the determination to make them real. But more than just being a successful event, the Great Exhibition represented something deeper about Albert's philosophy and about what he and Victoria were trying to achieve. The exhibition was a statement of faith in progress, in the idea that humanity was moving forward and that technology and industry could improve people's lives. It was a statement of faith in international cooperation, showing that nations could come together peacefully to celebrate their achievements rather than fighting wars. It was a statement of faith in education and accessibility, allowing ordinary people to experience art and innovation that would have previously been restricted to the elite. These were Albert's core beliefs made physical, given form in iron and glass in the middle of Hyde Park. The profits from the Great Exhibition were used to establish new museums and educational institutions in South Kensington, which became a centre for art, science, and culture. The Victoria and Albert Museum, the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, all of these were funded by the exhibition's success and reflected Albert's commitment to making knowledge available to everyone. This was his legacy being built in real time, institutions that would outlast him and continue promoting the values he cared about long after he was gone. After the Great Exhibition, Albert's reputation in Britain transformed completely. The press that had mocked him now praised him as a genius. Politicians who had dismissed him now sought his advice. The public adored him. He'd proven that he wasn't just the Queen's German husband. He was a force for good in his own right, someone who could imagine a better future and make it happen. Victoria was thrilled and vindicated. She'd been telling everyone for years that Albert was wonderful, and now everyone finally believed her. Their partnership, which had been so rocky in the early years, had solidified into something powerful. But success didn't mean Albert stopped working. If anything, he became more ambitious. He pushed for reforms in the army, trying to improve conditions for soldiers and modernise military practices. He advocated for better sanitation and public health measures, understanding that cholera and typhoid were killing thousands of people every year and that engineering solutions could save lives. He promoted education reforms, arguing that Britain needed to invest in schools and universities if it wanted to remain competitive. He redesigned royal residences, bringing in modern conveniences and showing that tradition and progress weren't mutually exclusive. Every project was driven by the same principle. Things could be better, and it was possible to make them better if you were willing to do the work. Victoria and Albert were now functioning as genuine partners. She would bring him political questions and they'd work through them together. He would propose initiatives, and she'd use her authority to make them happen. They'd raised 7 children by this point, and while Victoria still didn't particularly enjoy the baby phase, they were both invested in their children's education and futures. They took family holidays to Scotland, where they'd built Balmoral Castle as a private retreat. They attended concerts and theatre together. They had inside jokes and shared memories. They'd built a life that worked, and they'd done it despite everything that had been stacked against them at the beginning. The tragedy, and we'll get to this more in later chapters, is that Albert worked too hard. He took on too much. He couldn't say no to a project that might help people or improve society. He drove himself relentlessly, pushing through exhaustion and health problems, because there was always more work to be done. Victoria watched this happening and worried about him, but she also relied on him so completely that she couldn't imagine asking him to slow down. They'd finally figured out how to be partners, how to work together, how to build something meaningful. And Albert was slowly burning himself out in the process. But in the 1850s, in the decade after the Great Exhibition, none of that was obvious yet. What was obvious was that the German prince who had arrived in Britain as an outsider, who had been mocked and dismissed and given no formal authority, had somehow managed to become one of the most influential people in the country. He'd done it not through constitutional power, but through competence, vision, and sheer determination. He'd taken the humiliating position of prince consort and transformed it into something meaningful. He'd proven that you don't need a crown to change an empire. You just need a good idea, the ability to work harder than anyone else, and a partner who believes in you. That partnership between Victoria and Albert, the one that started so badly and took years to develop, became the foundation of everything they achieved. She had the authority and the political understanding. He had the vision and the willingness to do the detail work. Together they weren't just a royal couple going through the motions of public life. They were actively trying to make Britain better, to modernise the monarchy, to use their position for something more than ceremony and tradition. It wasn't always smooth. They still fought sometimes, still had disagreements about the right approach to various problems. But they'd learned to work through those disagreements instead of letting them destroy their relationship. They'd learned that partnership doesn't mean always agreeing. It means respecting each other enough to find solutions together. The story of Albert as prince consort is really the story of finding purpose when the world tells you you're purposeless. He could have given up after those first miserable years. He could have become bitter and resentful, spending his life as a decorative accessory to Victoria's reign. Many men in his position would have. But Albert was too stubborn and too driven to accept uselessness. He carved out a role for himself through sheer force of will and talent, and in doing so, he changed what it meant to be prince consort. He set a template that future royal spouses would follow, showing that you could support the monarch while still maintaining your own identity and pursuing your own goals. The position that had seemed like a punishment became, in Albert's hands, an opportunity. And that transformation, from powerless husband to influential partner, is what made their story remarkable. Now that we've covered the public partnership, the political achievements, the Great Exhibition, and all the impressive stuff that historians usually focus on, let's talk about what was actually happening behind closed doors. Because here's the thing about Victoria and Albert that most history books gloss over or treat with uncomfortable euphemisms. They were absolutely wild about each other physically. Like genuinely passionate in a way that would make modern romance novelists take notes. And we know this in excruciating detail because Victoria wrote everything down in her diaries, and neither she nor Albert were particularly shy about expressing their feelings in letters, even when they were literally in the same building. Victoria kept a diary from age 13 until shortly before her death. We're talking about decades of daily entries, hundreds of volumes, millions of words. Most of it is mundane stuff, who she met with, what she wore, what the weather was like. But scattered throughout, especially in the years of her marriage to Albert, are entries that are shockingly frank about her physical attraction to her husband. This was not what respectable Victorian ladies were supposed to write about, even in private diaries. The whole Victorian era gets its reputation for sexual repression from somewhere, and it's not entirely unearned. But Victoria, who gave her name to that era, apparently didn't get the memo about keeping quiet about marital intimacy. Let's start with their wedding night, because Victoria's diary entry from February 10th, 1840, sets the tone for everything that follows. She wrote about retiring to their rooms after the wedding festivities, about how nervous and happy she was, and then she just comes right out and says that the experience was beyond her expectations, that she'd never felt so loved, that being close to Albert was the greatest happiness she'd ever known. This is not subtle Victorian-era code language. This is a woman saying I had a great time on my wedding night and I'm not pretending otherwise. In an era where most women of her class were taught that marital intimacy was a duty to be endured rather than enjoyed, Victoria's openness about physical pleasure was revolutionary. And it wasn't just the wedding night. Throughout their marriage, Victoria's diary entries are full of references to how much she enjoyed being physically close to Albert. She'd write about lying in his arms, about how safe and happy she felt when they were alone together, about missing him desperately when they had to be apart even for a day or two. She used German terms of endearment that she'd learned from him. She drew little sketches of him in the margins of her diary. She was, in modern terms, completely smitten, and not remotely embarrassed about it. This was a woman who ruled the largest empire in the world and commanded respect from prime ministers and generals. But in her private writings, she was just someone who was deeply, obviously in love with her husband, and wanted everyone to know it. Albert was more reserved in his written expressions, which tracks with his general personality. He wasn't the type to gush in diaries. But his letters to Victoria, even the ones he wrote when he was just down the hall in a different room, are incredibly tender. He'd write to her about how much he missed seeing her face, about how the hours until they could be together again felt endless, about how she was the light of his life and his greatest blessing. He'd sign letters with dozens of X's for kisses, which is adorable and also slightly absurd when you remember this is a serious German prince who spent his days dealing with matters of state and army reform. The man had layers, basically. Publicly serious and controlled, privately affectionate and surprisingly romantic. They also wrote to each other when they argued, which happened frequently enough that there's a whole collection of these letters. When they had a fight, instead of just yelling at each other until one of them stormed off, which was Victoria's preferred method early in their marriage, they'd eventually retreat to separate rooms and write letters explaining their positions. This was probably healthier than screaming, though it's also slightly ridiculous. Imagine being a palace servant and having to deliver a letter from the Queen to the Prince Consort who is literally 2 rooms away. The content of these letters varied from heartfelt apologies to passionate defences of their positions, to occasional cutting remarks that showed they both knew exactly how to hurt each other when they were angry. One famous incident involved an argument so intense that Albert locked himself in his room and refused to come out. Victoria stood outside the door demanding he open it immediately. He asked who was there. She said, "The Queen," in her most imperious voice, expecting instant obedience. Albert, who was apparently done taking orders that day, said nothing and kept the door locked. Victoria knocked again, same question from Albert. This time she said, slightly less imperiously, "Your wife." Still no response. Finally getting desperate, she knocked a 3rd time, and when Albert asked who was there, she said quietly, "Victoria." The door opened immediately. This story might be apocryphal, but it's been told enough times that it's entered the mythology of their relationship, and it captures something true about their dynamic. Victoria had to learn that being queen didn't work in their private life. With Albert, she had to be just Victoria, not the monarch, not the ruler of nations, just a woman who loved her husband and sometimes needed to set aside her pride to make things right. Their correspondence also reveals all the little domestic details that make them feel like real people, instead of historical figures. Victoria would write to Albert about the children, about household matters, about her frustration with various ministers or courtiers. Albert would write to Victoria about projects he was working on, books he was reading, his longing for the forests and countryside of his childhood in Germany. He was always slightly homesick for Coburg, missing the simple pleasures of hunting in the woods and walking through landscapes that felt familiar and comfortable. Britain never quite felt like home to him, even after decades of living there. It was where his work was, where his wife was, where his children were growing up. But home, in his heart, was always Germany. This homesickness comes through in his letters to his brother Ernst, who stayed in Coburg and inherited their father's duchy. Albert would write long letters about how he missed the forests, the mountains, the pace of life that was slower and less frantically busy than London. He'd describe his work in Britain, his projects and achievements, but there was always an undercurrent of melancholy, a sense that he'd sacrificed something essential when he left Germany. Ernst would write back with news from home, and you can tell from Albert's responses that these letters were precious to him, a connection to the world he'd left behind. It's actually quite sad, this portrait of a man who was successful and influential, and married to someone who loved him desperately, but who never quite stopped missing home. Victoria understood this about Albert, and it bothered her. Not because she was unsympathetic, but because she wanted to be enough for him. She wanted their life together in Britain to be so fulfilling that he wouldn't need to long for Germany. This was probably impossible, since homesickness isn't really something you logic your way out of, but Victoria tried anyway. She'd planned trips to Scotland, which wasn't Germany, but at least got them out of London and into countryside where Albert felt more comfortable. She'd encourage him to invite German friends and family to visit. She'd learn German phrases and cook German foods, and try to create little pockets of Germanness within their British life. It was touching, really, the effort she put into making Albert feel less displaced. She couldn't give him back his homeland, but she could show him that she understood what he'd sacrificed to be with her. Their private life together also involved a lot of music, which was one of their genuine shared pleasures. Albert played piano beautifully, and Victoria loved listening to him play. She'd write in her diary about evenings when Albert would play for her, usually German composers like Beethoven or Mendelssohn, and she'd sit and listen and feel completely content. She wasn't a particularly skilled musician herself, though she could sing reasonably well. But she appreciated music deeply, and it was one of the few times she could just be passive and enjoy something without having to be in charge. Albert also composed a few pieces, nothing that's remembered today, but Victoria treasured them and would request them frequently. It was their version of Netflix and chill, basically. After long days of state business and public appearances, they'd retreat to their private rooms and Albert would play piano, and Victoria would relax, and for a little while they could forget they were the Queen and Prince Consort and just be two. People who enjoyed music together. They also shared a love of art, though their tastes were slightly different. Victoria liked portraits and landscapes, traditional representational art. Albert was more interested in contemporary movements and experimental techniques. They'd visit galleries together and have long discussions about what they were seeing, sometimes agreeing and sometimes having completely opposite reactions to the same piece. Victoria would tease Albert about his intellectual approach to art, his need to understand and analyse everything. Albert would tease Victoria about her sentimental attachment to paintings that reminded her of people or places she loved. But the teasing was affectionate, the kind of gentle mockery that only happens between people who know each other deeply and feel secure enough in the relationship to poke fun. Their physical relationship remained passionate throughout their marriage, which again is something we know because Victoria couldn't help writing about it. Even after years of marriage and multiple children, she'd write diary entries about how attractive she found Albert, how much she loved being alone with him, how the sight of him in his uniform made her heart race. This was not standard behaviour for Victorian ladies, let me repeat that. The cultural expectation was that women of Victoria's class would tolerate marital intimacy out of duty, and perhaps grow fond of their husbands over time, but certainly not express ongoing physical desire. Victoria just completely ignored these expectations and wrote frankly about how much she enjoyed her husband's company in every sense. Albert was less explicit in his writings, but he clearly felt the same way. In letters to Victoria, he'd reference their private time together in ways that were coded for public consumption, but clearly meaningful to them. He'd talk about longing to hold her again, about how empty his bed felt when they were apart, about counting the hours until they could be reunited. For someone who was generally emotionally controlled and proper in public, Albert was surprisingly expressive in private with Victoria. She'd broken through his walls in a way that nobody else ever had or would. She was the only person he fully trusted with his real feelings, and that vulnerability was something he gave only to her. They also fought about jealousy, which is simultaneously petty and completely understandable. Victoria was jealous of Albert's attention to basically anyone else. If he spent too long talking to another woman at a state dinner, Victoria would be upset for days. If he seemed more interested in a conversation about politics than in paying attention to her, she'd sulk. She wanted to be the centre of his world, and when she felt like she wasn't, she made sure everyone knew about it. This was not rational behaviour from the Queen of England, but emotions rarely are rational. Albert learned to navigate this by being extremely careful about how much attention he gave to other people in Victoria's presence, which must have been exhausting, but seemed like a reasonable price to pay for domestic peace. Albert had his own jealousies, though they were more subtle. He was jealous of Lord Melbourne, even though Melbourne was decades older, and Victoria's relationship with him had been completely platonic. The fact that Victoria had relied so heavily on Melbourne before Albert was allowed into her political life rankled. He was jealous of the ministers who got to spend time with Victoria discussing matters he wasn't allowed to be involved in during the early years of their marriage. He was even occasionally jealous of their children, particularly the babies who demanded so much of Victoria's attention. He'd never say this directly, because admitting jealousy would have felt like admitting weakness, but Victoria could tell. She'd write in her diary about having to reassure Albert that she loved him most of all, that nobody could replace him, that he was her partner in everything, which he was eventually, but it took time for him to really believe it. One of the most touching aspects of their private relationship was how they dealt with Victoria's pregnancies. Victoria hated being pregnant, made no secret of it, and Albert was incredibly supportive about this, even though it wasn't the response most Victorian husbands would have expected or accepted. She'd complain to him about feeling ill, about hating how her body changed, about resenting the whole process. Most men of that era would have told their wives to buck up and accept their natural role. Albert would sit with her, hold her hand, play piano for her to distract her from discomfort, take over as much of her work as possible to reduce her stress. He'd write her notes reminding her that the pregnancy wouldn't last forever, that she was doing something difficult and deserved credit for it, that he loved her and would support her through it. This was genuinely progressive for the 1840s and 1850s. The man was a proto-feminist without even having the vocabulary for it. After each birth, Victoria would write about how Albert had been there with her, supporting her through labour, which was absolutely not standard practice for aristocratic husbands. They were supposed to pace nervously in another room while their wives gave birth. Albert apparently decided that tradition was stupid and insisted on being present. Victoria credited him with keeping her calm during the births, with making the whole terrifying experience bearable. And then after the baby was born, Albert would take on a lot of the childcare responsibilities that Victorian fathers typically ignored. He'd rock babies to sleep, change diapers, play with toddlers, supervise older children's education. Victoria found babies annoying and overwhelming. Albert found them fascinating and was much more patient with the infant stage. So they divided responsibilities in a way that worked for them, regardless of what society expected. Their letters to each other about the children are particularly revealing. Victoria would write things like, "The baby was horrible today, cried constantly, I don't know what to do with him." Albert would write back with practical advice and gentle reassurance. When their eldest son Bertie was being particularly difficult, which was frequently, Victoria and Albert would commiserate in letters about the challenges of raising a child who didn't meet their expectations. These letters are sometimes uncomfortably honest about their disappointment in Bertie, their frustration with his lack of academic interest and his focus on pleasure over duty. Reading them now, knowing how much their constant criticism damaged Bertie, is painful. But it also shows that they were human, flawed parents trying their best and sometimes failing badly. They also wrote love letters to each other for anniversaries and birthdays, which is sweet and also slightly unnecessary given that they saw each other every day. But they both seemed to enjoy the ritual of putting feelings into words. Albert would write Victoria elaborate letters on their anniversary, recounting their years together, expressing gratitude for their partnership, reaffirming his love. Victoria would write back equally elaborate responses. They'd exchange these letters over breakfast, probably, sitting across from each other and reading about how much they loved each other while actually being in the same room. It's ridiculous and romantic and very much in character for both of them. The public nature of their affection was actually quite controversial in some circles. This was an era when aristocratic marriages were expected to be practical arrangements, and any genuine affection was considered slightly vulgar to display openly. But Victoria and Albert didn't care. They'd hold hands in public. They'd stand close together at events. Victoria would gaze at Albert in ways that made it very clear how she felt about him. People noticed, and opinions were mixed. Some found it charming that the Queen was so obviously devoted to her husband. Others thought it was unseemly, that royalty should maintain more emotional distance and dignity. Victoria ignored the critics entirely. She'd spent her childhood being controlled by other people's expectations, and she'd decided that her marriage was one area where she was going to do exactly what she wanted regardless of what anyone thought. This public display of affection also helped reshape British attitudes toward royal marriage in general. Before Victoria and Albert, royal marriages were understood to be political transactions. Nobody expected love, and nobody particularly cared if it developed. After Victoria and Albert, there was a new cultural expectation that maybe royal couples should actually like each other, that maybe love and duty weren't incompatible. They didn't single-handedly create modern romantic marriage, obviously. That was a much larger cultural shift happening across the Western world. But they were highly visible examples of a love match that actually worked, and their influence on public perception of marriage shouldn't be underestimated. Albert also brought Victoria small gifts constantly, which she treasured far more than expensive jewellery or formal presents. He'd sketch pictures for her. He'd write her little poems. He'd bring her flowers from the gardens. These were tiny gestures that showed he was thinking about her even when they were busy with separate tasks. Victoria kept everything. She had boxes of notes and sketches and dried flowers, all carefully preserved. After Albert's death, these small mementos became even more precious to her, evidence of all the little moments of affection that had made up their daily life together. Victoria also had a possessive streak that would probably be considered problematic by modern relationship standards. She didn't want to share Albert with anyone or anything. When he was absorbed in a project, she'd feel neglected even if he was doing important work. When he travelled without her, even for valid reasons, she'd be miserable and let him know it in detailed letters about how awful everything was in his absence. This wasn't manipulation exactly. She genuinely felt that strongly about being separated from him. But it did mean that Albert had very little independence or personal space. His entire life revolved around Victoria and her needs, and her schedule and her demands. For someone who was already working himself to exhaustion with various reform projects, having a wife who required constant emotional attention must have been draining. But Albert never complained about this, at least not in any surviving correspondence. He seemed to accept Victoria's emotional intensity as part of who she was, something he'd signed up for when he married her. He'd write reassuring letters when he travelled. He'd make time for her even when his schedule was overwhelming. He'd prioritise her feelings even when it meant setting aside his own needs. This was partly because he loved her and wanted her to be happy. It was also partly because keeping Victoria happy was necessary for his own work and influence. If she was upset with him, she'd freeze him out of political decisions and he'd lose the access he needed to accomplish anything. So being attentive to Victoria's emotional state was both personally important and professionally necessary. Their physical affection for each other, the fact that they genuinely enjoyed each other's company in every way, was actually kind of groundbreaking for British royalty. Previous royal marriages had been notoriously cold. George IV had hated his wife. William IV had loved his mistress but merely tolerated his wife. The expectation was that kings and queens would do their duty in producing heirs, and then pursue their real emotional connections elsewhere. Victoria and Albert showed that you could actually like the person you were married to, that duty and desire didn't have to be separate categories. This sounds obvious now, but in the context of 1840s British aristocracy, it was mildly revolutionary. They also had inside jokes and shared humour that nobody else understood, references to private moments, phrases that meant something only to them, teasing about each other's quirks. Victoria's diaries occasionally mention Albert making her laugh until she cried, though she never explains what about. These private moments of joy, the laughter that happened behind closed doors, are as important to understanding their relationship as any grand public gesture. They weren't just partners in ruling an empire. They genuinely enjoyed each other's company. They had fun together when they got the chance, which wasn't often enough but mattered when it happened. Victoria wrote about sex more explicitly than you'd expect from Victorian royalty, though she used euphemisms that were transparent enough. She'd write about nights when she and Albert were together, about how happy and complete she felt afterward, about how physical intimacy brought them closer emotionally. This was not just about reproduction or duty. This was about pleasure and connection and expressing love physically. The fact that Victoria was so open about enjoying marital intimacy probably helped normalise it for other Victorian women who read about her life. If the Queen could admit to enjoying her husband's company in bed, maybe it was acceptable for other women to feel the same way. Albert was more circumspect, but his letters occasionally included passages that were clearly about missing physical intimacy when they were apart. He'd write about longing to hold Victoria, about their bed feeling empty without her, about counting days until they could be together again. These weren't just romantic sentiments. These were expressions of genuine physical longing. The man was in his 20s and 30s during most of their marriage, healthy and attracted to his wife, and he wasn't shy about letting her know it in private correspondence. Their emotional connection deepened over the years rather than fading, which is relatively unusual in any marriage, but particularly in arranged royal marriages. The longer they were together, the more intertwined their lives became. They developed shorthand ways of communicating. They could read each other's moods instantly. They knew each other's triggers and sensitivities. Victoria knew when Albert was getting overwhelmed and needed rest, even when he wouldn't admit it himself. Albert knew when Victoria was anxious about something and needed reassurance. They'd learned each other's emotional languages and could respond appropriately most of the time. But they weren't perfect, and their private papers make that clear. They fought about money, about the children's education, about how much time Albert was spending on various projects. They hurt each other's feelings and sometimes didn't apologise as quickly as they should have. They made mistakes and had to figure out how to repair damage to their relationship. The difference between them and most royal couples of their era was that they actually cared enough to do the work of repairing damage. They didn't just live parallel lives with polite distance between them. They actively maintained their connection even when it was difficult. One recurring theme in their correspondence is how much they valued their private time together. Both of them had exhausting public schedules, constant demands on their attention, endless responsibilities that pulled them in different directions. The time they got to spend alone together, without servants or ministers or children interrupting, was precious and rare. They'd write about these moments like they were treasured memories, a quiet evening when they could just talk, a walk in the gardens at Windsor when nobody else was around, an hour in the music room with Albert playing piano and Victoria listening. These simple moments of peace in an otherwise hectic life were what sustained them emotionally. Their physical attraction to each other was also evident in how they talked about each other to other people. Victoria would tell her ladies-in-waiting how handsome Albert looked in various outfits. Albert would praise Victoria's appearance to anyone who would listen. They were both genuinely proud of how their spouse looked and didn't mind other people knowing it. This mutual attraction, lasting throughout their marriage, even after 9 children and decades together, suggests they genuinely lucked into a match where the chemistry worked. This wasn't just about strategic alliance or political necessity. They actually desired each other, which made everything else easier. The tragedy underlying all of this private happiness was that it couldn't last forever. Albert was working himself to death, literally, and Victoria could see it happening but couldn't figure out how to stop it. She'd beg him to rest, to take time off, to slow down. He'd promise he would, after this project was finished, after this reform was implemented, after this crisis was resolved. But there was always another project, another reform, another crisis. He was driven by a sense that he needed to accomplish as much as possible, to justify his existence in Britain, to make use of every opportunity. And Victoria, who loved him desperately but also relied on him completely for political and emotional support, couldn't bring herself to force him to stop working, even when she knew he was exhausted. Their private correspondence from the late 1850s and early 1860s shows the strain. Albert's letters mention chronic pain, exhaustion, difficulty sleeping. Victoria's diary entries express worry about his health and frustration, that he won't take better care of himself. They were both aware something was wrong, but neither of them knew how to break the cycle. Albert couldn't imagine not working. Victoria couldn't imagine functioning without Albert's support. So they continued, pushing forward, hoping things would somehow improve, not realizing they were running out of time. The details of their private life, all these letters and diary entries and small gestures and intimate moments, matter because they show that Victoria and Albert weren't just historical figures acting out predetermined roles. They were two people who genuinely loved each other, who built a life together despite enormous obstacles, who found joy and connection and meaning in their relationship. The public achievements matter, obviously. But the private happiness matters too, because it's what made everything else possible. They could handle the pressure of ruling an empire because they had each other. They could push through political fights and public criticism because they knew they'd have each other's support at the end of the day. Their love wasn't just a nice addition to their story. It was the foundation of everything they accomplished together. And that foundation, that deep emotional and physical connection, is what makes the end of their story so devastating. Because when you love someone that much, when your entire life is built around them, when you can't imagine existing without them, losing them doesn't just hurt. It breaks something fundamental inside you that never really heals. Victoria would spend the next 40 years proving exactly how much Albert had meant to her, how completely her life had revolved around him, how impossible it was to move forward after he was gone. But we're not there yet in the story. For now, they're still together, still building their partnership, still finding joy in each other's company despite all the pressures bearing down on them. For now, they're still writing love letters across the palace, and falling asleep in each other's arms and believing they have all the time in the world. So we've established that Victoria and Albert had a passionate, loving marriage and really enjoyed each other's company in all the ways that matter. The natural consequence of this, unfortunately for Victoria, was children. Lots of children. 9 children in 17 years, to be precise. Which sounds exhausting just to say out loud, and was apparently even more exhausting to actually live through, at least from Victoria's perspective. Because here's something that might surprise you about the woman who gave her name to an entire era, known for its emphasis on family values and domestic virtue. Victoria absolutely hated being pregnant and found babies genuinely repulsive. Let's start with the pregnancies, because Victoria's attitude toward them was refreshingly honest, in an era when women were expected to embrace motherhood as their highest calling. She hated every single aspect of being pregnant. The physical discomfort, the loss of mobility, the way pregnancy interfered with her ability to do her job as queen. She wrote in her diary and in letters to family members about how much she despised the whole process, using words like miserable, wretched, and unbearable. This was not the delicate Victorian euphemism you might expect. This was straightforward, I hate this and I'm not pretending otherwise. Modern historians have looked at some of Victoria's descriptions of her mental state during and after pregnancies and suggested she likely suffered from what we now call postpartum depression. The term didn't exist in the 1840s, obviously. The general medical understanding of women's mental health was somewhere between non-existent and actively harmful. If a new mother was struggling emotionally, the diagnosis was usually something vague like hysteria or nervous exhaustion, and the treatment was rest and avoiding excitement, which is not particularly helpful when you're trying to care for an infant, and also rule the largest empire on earth. Victoria would describe feeling overwhelmed, anxious, unable to cope with normal responsibilities, deeply unhappy even when she knew she should be grateful for her healthy children. These are classic symptoms of postpartum depression, but nobody around her had the framework to understand that or treat it effectively. Albert was actually surprisingly supportive about Victoria's pregnancy complaints, which was progressive for his time. Most Victorian husbands would have told their wives to suffer in silence and accept this as their natural female duty. Albert acknowledged that pregnancy was difficult and tried to make things easier for her by taking over more of her official responsibilities and being present during the births themselves, which was extremely unusual. Male doctors were increasingly involved in aristocratic births during this period, but husbands were still expected to stay away and let the women handle it. Albert ignored that convention entirely and insisted on being with Victoria during labour, which she deeply appreciated even if she still hated the entire experience. But here's where Victoria's attitude gets really interesting. She didn't just dislike being pregnant, she actively disliked babies, her own babies. She'd write things like, "An ugly baby is a very nasty object," in letters to her eldest daughter. She found infants disgusting when they were newborns, all red and wrinkled and crying constantly. She thought they were only tolerable after they were about 4 months old and started developing some personality. She complained about how boring babies were, how they just ate and slept and cried and provided no interesting conversation. This is the Queen of England talking about her own children, remember? The woman who was supposed to be the ultimate symbol of maternal devotion found her own offspring annoying and said so repeatedly. Modern parents might actually find this somewhat relatable, because the cultural pressure to pretend that every moment of parenthood is magical and fulfilling is exhausting, and Victoria just completely rejected it. She was honest about the fact that she found large parts of motherhood unpleasant and frustrating. She loved her children in the abstract and certainly wanted the best for them. But she didn't enjoy the infant stage at all and wasn't going to pretend she did. This made her unusual among Victorian aristocratic mothers, most of whom at least pretended to embrace the whole maternal ideal, even if they were actually handing their babies off to nurses and nannies as quickly as possible. Which brings us to the question of how much actual childcare Victoria did herself. The answer is, not much by modern standards. But by Victorian aristocratic standards, she was actually relatively involved. She didn't nurse her babies, which was standard for upper-class women of her era. Breastfeeding was seen as something common women did, and wealthy mothers used wet nurses instead. She didn't change diapers or deal with the messy practical aspects of infant care. That was what servants were for. But she did spend time with her children most days, checked on their education and development, and was definitely more present in their lives than many aristocratic parents who basically outsourced parenting entirely to staff and only saw their children for formal occasions. Albert was far more involved than Victoria, and far more involved than most Victorian fathers. He genuinely enjoyed children in a way that Victoria didn't. He'd play with them, read to them, supervise their lessons, plan their education in meticulous detail. He took his role as father seriously, viewing it as one of his primary responsibilities now that he'd produced heirs for the British throne. The problem was that Albert's approach to parenting was essentially the same as his approach to everything else: perfectionistic, demanding, focused on improvement and achievement. He wanted his children to be excellent. Not just good enough, but excellent. And he was willing to push them relentlessly to achieve that excellence, regardless of whether they were actually capable of it or even interested in it. This created a household dynamic that was honestly kind of toxic, though with the best intentions. Victoria hated dealing with babies and young children, so she was often distant and irritable with them during their early years. Albert loved them but had impossibly high standards and made those standards very clear. The children grew up knowing that their father loved them but was constantly disappointed in them, and their mother found them annoying unless they were being perfectly behaved and entertaining. Not exactly the nurturing environment that child psychologists would recommend, though again, child psychology didn't really exist as a field yet. They had 9 children total, born between 1840 and 1857. Let's run through them quickly, because each one had a different experience of having Victoria and Albert as parents, and their varying reactions to that experience tell us a lot about what was actually happening in the royal household. First was Victoria, called Vicky, born November 1840. She was Albert's favourite, which was obvious to everyone, including the other children. Vicky was intelligent, serious, interested in learning, basically a female version of Albert himself. He poured attention and education into her, and she thrived under it. She'd grow up to marry the Crown Prince of Prussia and become German Empress briefly before her husband died. She was probably the most successful of their children in terms of meeting her parents' expectations. Next was Albert Edward, called Bertie, born November 1841. He was the heir to the throne, which meant he carried the weight of enormous expectations from birth. And he was, unfortunately for everyone involved, absolutely nothing like what his parents wanted him to be. Bertie was not scholarly. He was not serious. He was not interested in moral improvement or intellectual pursuits. He liked parties, pretty women, food, entertainment, all the frivolous pleasures that made Albert deeply disappointed. The relationship between Albert and Bertie was strained from early childhood and only got worse as Bertie grew up, and it became clear he would never be the perfect prince his father wanted him to be. Then came Alice in 1843, Helena in 1846, Louise in 1848, Arthur in 1850, Leopold in 1853, and finally Beatrice in 1857. The younger children got progressively less intense parental attention because Victoria and Albert were busy with older children and affairs of state. This was probably actually better for them in some ways, since less attention meant less pressure to be perfect. But it also meant they felt somewhat neglected, particularly the middle children who were neither the important heirs like Vicky and Bertie, nor the babies who got coddled like Beatrice. The education plan Albert designed for his children was rigorous to the point of being cruel, especially for Bertie. He believed that proper education could shape character and create the ideal ruler, so he constructed elaborate curricula with detailed schedules. The children had lessons in multiple languages: history, mathematics, science, literature, music, art, physical education, religion, moral philosophy, basically everything Albert thought they should know to be cultured, intelligent, responsible. Adults. This was actually quite progressive for the era in some ways. Girls received the same serious education as boys, which was unusual, but the schedule was exhausting and allowed very little time for play or relaxation. Bertie's education was particularly intense because he was the heir. Albert designed a program that would have challenged a motivated adult scholar and imposed it on a child who just wanted to play and have fun. Bertie had lessons from early morning until evening, with different tutors for different subjects, constant examinations to test his progress, minimal free time. When he didn't perform to Albert's standards, which was often, Albert would express disappointment in ways that made it clear he found his son inadequate. Victoria would join in, writing in her diary about how Bertie was lazy and stupid and nothing like his brilliant father. Can you imagine being a child and knowing your parents think you're a disappointment? That they've decided you're intellectually inferior and are constantly frustrated by your existence? It's genuinely painful to read about. The thing is, Bertie wasn't stupid. He was actually reasonably intelligent and quite charming when he was allowed to be himself. He just wasn't an intellectual, and he learned differently than Albert did. Modern educational psychology would probably diagnose him with some kind of learning difference that required different teaching methods. But in the 1840s and 1850s, the assumption was that any child could learn anything if they just tried hard enough and had enough discipline imposed on them. So when Bertie struggled with his lessons, the solution was always more pressure, more discipline, more tutors, more examinations. It never occurred to Albert that maybe the problem wasn't Bertie's lack of effort, but the completely inappropriate educational approach. The psychological damage this did to Bertie was significant and permanent. He grew up believing he was stupid because his parents told him so repeatedly. He developed anxiety around academic performance. He rebelled by pursuing exactly the kind of frivolous pleasures his parents most disapproved of, probably because if he couldn't make them proud, he might as well make himself happy. The relationship between Bertie and his parents never recovered. Even as an adult, he was desperately seeking their approval and never quite getting it. This would have lasting effects on Bertie's own character and reign when he eventually became King Edward VII, but that's decades in the future at this point in the story. Victoria and Albert also had very specific ideas about their children's marriages, because this is where personal family life intersected with international politics. They saw their children as pieces on a European chessboard, tools for creating alliances and spreading British influence across the continent. Albert in particular had a grand vision of uniting Europe through marriage alliances, creating a network of royal families all related to each other, and therefore theoretically less likely to go to war. This was idealistic and well-intentioned, and as World War I would later prove, completely ineffective at actually preventing conflict. But in the 1850s, it seemed like a brilliant strategy. The children were raised knowing that their marriages would be political arrangements, not personal choices. They would marry other royals from appropriate countries, creating alliances that benefited Britain and promoted peace. Love would be nice if it happened, but it wasn't the priority. Duty came first. This was standard aristocratic practice, but Victoria and Albert approached it with particular intensity, because they believed they were literally shaping the future of Europe through their children's marriages. Vicky's marriage was the first major test of this strategy. Albert arranged for her to marry Prince Frederick of Prussia, who would eventually become German emperor. Vicky was 14 when she was effectively engaged, 18 when she actually married. She loved Fritz, fortunately, so the political marriage happened to also be emotionally successful. But she was also heartbroken to leave Britain and move to Prussia, where the court was more conservative and hostile to her British ways. Victoria cried for days when Vicky left, one of the few times her maternal feelings came through clearly. She'd just married off her daughter to secure a political alliance, and she was devastated by the separation. The contradiction between their strategic use of children's marriages and their genuine emotional bonds with those children created a lot of pain for everyone involved. The other children's marriages followed similar patterns. Alice married a German prince. Helena married a German prince. Louise married a Scottish duke, which was unusual and slightly scandalous, but accepted because she was a younger daughter. Arthur had a military career and married a Prussian princess. Leopold, who had haemophilia and was Victoria's favourite among her sons, married a German princess despite health problems that made the marriage complicated. Beatrice, the baby, married a German prince, but only after Victoria made her promise to keep living with her mother, because Victoria couldn't stand the idea of losing another child to marriage and distance. Bertie's marriage was perhaps the most carefully orchestrated and the most problematic. Albert and Victoria searched for years for the perfect bride, someone beautiful enough that Bertie wouldn't stray, intelligent enough to be a good influence, royal enough to be appropriate. They eventually settled on Princess Alexandra of Denmark, who was lovely and sweet and completely unprepared to manage Bertie's complicated personality. The engagement and marriage were supposed to settle Bertie down, make him more responsible. Instead, they just gave him more freedom to pursue his extramarital affairs while having a respectable wife at home. This was not what Albert and Victoria had envisioned, but by the time they realised the marriage wasn't solving Bertie's problems, Albert was already dying, and Victoria was too grief-stricken to deal with it effectively. The broader dynastic strategy did technically work in terms of spreading their descendants across Europe. Victoria's grandchildren eventually became rulers, or married rulers in Britain, Germany, Russia, Spain, Norway, Romania, Sweden, and Greece. She became known as the Grandmother of Europe, which sounds sweet until you remember that all those related royal families ended up fighting each other in World War I, making it essentially a massive family civil war. The strategy of uniting Europe through marriage didn't prevent conflict. It just made the conflict more personally tragic when it happened. Back to the actual parenting, though, because that's where the real human drama was happening. Victoria and Albert were dealing with 9 children with wildly different personalities, needs, and capabilities, and they were trying to parent them all according to the same rigid principles of duty, excellence, and moral improvement. This worked fine for children like Vicky, who naturally aligned with those values. It was a disaster for children like Bertie, who didn't. The middle children got lost in the shuffle. The younger children grew up in the shadow of their older siblings' expectations. Alice, the third child, was sensitive and empathetic and ended up being the family peacemaker. She tried to smooth over conflicts between her parents and Bertie, between siblings, between anyone who was fighting. This is a classic middle child role, trying to keep everyone happy and maintain family harmony. She married into German royalty and died young during a diphtheria outbreak, which devastated Victoria. Helena was practical and dutiful, and stayed close to her mother, becoming one of Victoria's main supports in later life. Louise was artistic and independent and chafed against royal restrictions. Arthur was his mother's favourite son, possibly because he went into the military and was rarely around to disappoint her. Leopold had haemophilia, which he'd inherited from Victoria's family line, and his life was constrained by constant health problems. Beatrice was the baby, born when Victoria was 38, and she became Victoria's companion and essentially gave up her own life to stay with her mother. The question of how good Victoria and Albert actually were as parents is complicated, and depends entirely on what standards you're using. By Victorian aristocratic standards, they were quite good. They were present in their children's lives more than most parents of their class. They invested significant time and resources in education. They genuinely cared about their children's well-being and futures. They weren't neglectful or abusive in the ways that some aristocratic parents were, but by modern parenting standards, they were kind of terrible. They had impossibly high expectations. They were emotionally distant when their children most needed support. They prioritized duty and appearance over individual happiness. They damaged at least one child, Bertie, quite severely through their demands and disappointment. The children's own accounts of their upbringing are telling. Some of them, like Vicky, remembered their childhood relatively positively. She'd been the favourite, so of course she had better memories. Others, like Bertie, clearly carried deep wounds from feeling inadequate and disapproved of. The younger children mostly remember being somewhat ignored, which bothered them less than being constantly criticised, but still wasn't ideal. None of them seemed to think their parents were monsters, but none of them emerged from childhood completely unscathed either. Victoria's relationship with her daughters was particularly complex. She loved them, but also competed with them for Albert's attention. She wanted them to be accomplished, but not more accomplished than her. She was proud when they made good marriages, but devastated when they left home. She gave them advice that was often contradictory, telling them to be dutiful wives but also maintain their own power, to be good mothers but not let motherhood define them entirely. Her letters to her married daughters are full of this kind of conflicting guidance, revealing her own confusion about how women should navigate marriage and motherhood and power. Albert's relationship with his sons was equally complicated. He wanted them to be perfect versions of himself, intelligent, cultured, moral, dedicated to public service. Arthur came closest to meeting these expectations, probably because he was in the military and away from home, so Albert couldn't see his flaws up close. Leopold tried hard but was constrained by his illness. Bertie was the constant disappointment, the reminder that you can't force someone to become what they're not, no matter how much education and discipline you apply. Albert never figured out how to accept Bertie for who he was rather than being frustrated by who he wasn't. The household structure didn't help matters. Victoria and Albert essentially lived separately from their children for large parts of the year. The children had their own household with governesses and tutors. The parents would visit, check on progress, attend special occasions, but daily childcare was handled by staff. This was completely normal for aristocratic families. But it meant that the time Victoria and Albert did spend with their children was often focused on evaluation rather than connection. Were the children learning their lessons? Were they behaving properly? Were they meeting expectations? The relationship was more like a boss checking in with employees than parents bonding with their kids. Mealtimes were formal affairs where children were expected to be seen and not heard unless asked a direct question. There wasn't casual conversation or joking around. Everything was structured and controlled. The children's letters to their parents were vetted by governesses to make sure they were appropriately respectful and grammatically correct. Even supposedly personal communication was mediated and formal. This created emotional distance that made genuine intimacy difficult. The children knew they were loved in an abstract sense, but they didn't always feel loved in a practical daily way. Victoria and Albert also disagreed sometimes about parenting decisions, which created confusion for the children who weren't sure which parents' standards they were supposed to meet. Victoria would sometimes be more lenient, particularly if she was in a good mood, or if Albert wasn't around to enforce his stricter rules. Albert would then be frustrated that Victoria had undermined his discipline. They'd argue about it, probably while the children pretended not to hear, and then either Victoria would defer to Albert or they'd reach some compromise that satisfied neither of them. This kind of parental inconsistency is confusing for children and makes it harder for them to understand expectations. The physical affection in the household was also limited by Victorian standards of propriety. There wasn't a lot of hugging or physical comfort offered to children who were upset. Emotions were supposed to be controlled, not indulged. Crying was discouraged as a sign of weakness. Even when children were hurt or scared, they were expected to maintain composure. This emotional suppression had lasting effects on all of them, creating adults who struggled to express feelings or seek emotional support when they needed it. But here's what's interesting and important to remember. Victoria and Albert genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They weren't being cruel for cruelty's sake. They were following the best parenting practices of their era as understood by educated, thoughtful people. They believed that high expectations would inspire their children to excellence. They believed that emotional control would create strong character. They believed that rigorous education would prepare their children for the complex demands of royal life. They were wrong about a lot of this, as we now understand with better psychological and educational knowledge. But they were trying to be good parents according to the information and cultural context they had available. The tragedy is that their genuine love for their children and their destructive parenting practices coexisted. They could love their kids deeply while also damaging them. They could want the best for their children while creating conditions that made it impossible for those children to feel good enough. They could be more involved than most aristocratic parents while still being emotionally distant in ways that hurt. Parenting is complicated, and being royal parents in the 1840s and 1850s, with all the additional pressures and expectations, made it even more complicated. Their children's later lives reflected this complicated upbringing. Vicky became a reforming empress in Germany, trying to liberalize the Prussian system, largely successful in personal terms but ultimately unable to prevent Germany's authoritarian trajectory. Bertie became a controversial but ultimately quite effective king, though he spent his entire life craving the approval his parents never gave him. Alice devoted herself to nursing and social welfare, dying young in service to others. The other children had varying degrees of happiness and success, but all of them carried marks from their childhood, both positive and negative. The dynastic marriages created a web of connections across Europe that looked impressive on paper, but didn't actually create the lasting peace Albert had envisioned. Instead, it meant that when World War I broke out, family members were literally fighting family members across battle lines. Kaiser Wilhelm II, Vicky's son and Victoria's grandson, was at war with his British cousins. The Russian Tsar, married to another of Victoria's granddaughters, was fighting against his wife's relatives. The strategy had backfired in the most tragic way possible. But in the 1850s, none of that was visible yet. Victoria and Albert were still building their family, still trying to balance parenting with ruling an empire, still believing their careful plans would create a better future. They had their successes and failures as parents, just like everyone else. The difference was that their successes and failures played out on a grand stage with geopolitical consequences and got recorded in exhaustive detail for historians to analyse forever. They couldn't just make mistakes in private and learn from them quietly. Everything they did mattered, or at least felt like it mattered, because their children weren't just their children. They were future rulers, alliance builders, representatives of British interests across Europe. The pressure of this must have been exhausting for Victoria and Albert, and absolutely crushing for their children. Imagine growing up knowing that your marriage isn't really your choice, that your education is about preparing you for dynastic duty, that your parents love you but also see you as pieces in a grand strategic game. Some children handled this better than others, but all of them carried the weight of being royal children, expected to sacrifice personal happiness for duty, and knowing that failing to do so would disappoint not just their parents, but an entire nation. This is the context we need to understand before we get to the final chapters of this story. Victoria and Albert weren't just a romantic couple working together to reform Britain. They were also parents trying to raise 9 children under impossible circumstances, making mistakes and damaging those children in ways they didn't fully understand at the time. When Albert dies, Victoria won't just be losing her husband and partner, she'll be losing her co-parent, the person who shared the burden of raising these complicated children and planning their futures. She'll be left to handle the consequences of their parenting decisions alone, while also dealing with grief so profound it would define the rest of her life. But we're not quite there yet. We have a few more pieces to put in place first. We've talked about all the wonderful things Albert accomplished, the reforms he pushed through, the great exhibition, the partnership he built with Victoria. But success came with a price, and that price was being extracted from Albert's body and mind in ways that were becoming increasingly obvious to anyone who looked closely. The problem was that almost nobody looked closely enough, including Victoria, who should have noticed but was too dependent on Albert to imagine life without him functioning at full capacity. This is the part of the story where everything starts going wrong, slowly enough that it feels like it might still be fixable, but fast enough that fixing it was probably never really possible. Let's start with the Crimean War, which ran from 1853 to 1856, and was an absolute disaster in almost every way that a war can be disastrous. Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire fighting Russia over territorial disputes that most British people couldn't explain if you asked them. The conduct of the war was incompetent enough that it became a national scandal. Soldiers dying not from battle wounds but from cholera, dysentery, exposure, and general neglect, because nobody had bothered to plan for basic logistics like food, medical care, or adequate winter clothing. This was the war that made Florence Nightingale famous for trying to reform military hospitals, which tells you how bad things must have been if one nurse with some common sense became a national hero, just for suggesting that maybe soldiers shouldn't die from infected wounds in filthy conditions. Albert threw himself into trying to reform the military system that had allowed this catastrophe to happen. He wasn't responsible for starting the war or managing it initially, but he felt responsible for fixing the problems that were killing British soldiers. He studied military organisation, supply chains, hospital conditions, everything that was going wrong. He pushed for reforms in how the army was structured, how officers were selected and trained, how supplies were managed. He worked with Nightingale and other reformers to improve medical care. He wrote reports, attended meetings, lobbied reluctant generals and politicians who didn't want to change systems they'd grown comfortable with. This was on top of all his other projects and responsibilities. The work was exhausting and largely thankless. The military establishment resented being criticised by a German prince who'd never served in combat. Politicians were reluctant to spend money on reforms when the war was already expensive enough. Progress was slow and frustrating, requiring constant effort to move even small changes forward. And the whole time, British soldiers were still dying preventable deaths, which weighed on Albert's conscience, even though none of it was directly his fault. He couldn't save them all, but he couldn't stop trying either, even when the effort was clearly wearing him down. Victoria was proud of Albert's work on military reform, but she also needed him to continue handling all his other responsibilities. Because here's what had happened over the years since they'd married. Victoria had gradually transferred more and more of her workload to Albert. He was reading state papers, drafting correspondence, meeting with ministers, basically doing a huge portion of the actual governing while Victoria handled the ceremonial aspects and made final decisions. This was practical in many ways. Albert was good at the detail work and Victoria trusted his judgment. But it meant Albert was essentially doing two jobs, his own projects and reforms plus a significant chunk of the monarch's constitutional duties, and he couldn't say no. Partly because he genuinely wanted to help Victoria and support her reign. Partly because staying involved in government business gave his life purpose and meaning in a role that otherwise had no formal power. Partly because Victoria's dependence on him was the foundation of their partnership, and if he pulled back from that work, he'd be risking the relationship that meant everything to him. So he kept taking on more, kept pushing himself harder, kept saying yes to every new project and responsibility, even when he was already stretched beyond reasonable limits. The physical toll started showing up in the late 1850s. Albert began having chronic stomach pains that doctors couldn't adequately explain or treat. This was an era when medical understanding of digestive issues was primitive at best, and the treatments ranged from useless to actively harmful. The go-to remedies were things like bleeding, purging, or various mysterious tinctures that probably did more harm than good. Nobody understood stress-related illness, or how chronic overwork could manifest as physical symptoms. If you complained of stomach pain, doctors would poke around, prescribe some awful medicine, and tell you to rest, which Albert never actually did. The pain wasn't constant, but it was frequent enough to be debilitating. Albert would be in the middle of work and have to stop because the pain was too intense to continue. He'd spend hours lying down trying to manage it, then force himself back to his desk because there was always more work to do. Victoria would worry and fuss over him, but she'd also need him to review papers or attend meetings, and he'd drag himself up and do it because that's what she needed. The cycle of pain, minimal rest, and returning to work meant he never fully recovered. The problems just accumulated. He also wasn't sleeping well, which should surprise absolutely nobody given the amount of stress he was under. Insomnia is the body's way of saying you need to deal with your problems, except Albert's problems were largely unfixable, or would require him to fundamentally change his approach to life and work. He'd lie awake worrying about unfinished projects, about political crises, about whether he was doing enough, about his children's futures. Sleep deprivation then made everything worse, reducing his ability to cope with stress and making physical pain feel more intense. This is basic physiology, but again, Victorian medicine didn't really understand the connection between sleep, stress, and overall health. His mental state was also declining, though nobody used terms like depression or burnout in the 1860s. Albert started showing signs of what we'd now recognise as depression. He'd write to his brother Ernst about feeling overwhelmed and hopeless. He'd tell Victoria he didn't know how much longer he could keep working at this pace. He'd expressed doubts about whether anything he was doing actually mattered or made a difference. These weren't just moments of tiredness. These were signs of someone whose mental health was seriously compromised by chronic stress and overwork. Victoria noticed these problems but fundamentally misunderstood what they meant. She thought Albert was having temporary health issues that would resolve with rest and medical attention. She didn't grasp that the root cause was the impossible workload and constant pressure, because she was a major source of that pressure. She needed Albert to function. Her entire system of governing depended on his support. Her emotional well-being depended on his presence and attention. She couldn't afford to acknowledge that maybe she was asking too much of him, because then she'd have to change her behaviour, and change is hard even when you're the Queen of England. There's a tragic pattern in their correspondence from this period. Albert would express exhaustion or pain. Victoria would sympathise and suggest he rest. Then, in the same letter or the next day, she'd ask him to handle some urgent matter that required his immediate attention. Albert would do it because he couldn't stand letting Victoria down. They were trapped in a dynamic where Victoria's dependence on Albert was literally killing him, and neither of them could figure out how to break the pattern, because the alternative, Victoria learning to function without Albert's constant support, felt impossible to both of them. Friends and family members occasionally tried to intervene, suggesting that Albert needed to slow down or take extended time off. Albert would agree in principle, but then find reasons why he couldn't actually do it. There was always a crisis that needed his attention, always a reform that was at a critical stage, always something that couldn't wait. The man had spent his entire life believing that his value came from what he accomplished and how useful he was. The idea of stepping back from work felt like admitting he was no longer valuable, which was psychologically unbearable. So he pushed through, and the problems got worse. Then came 1861, which was when everything started accelerating toward disaster. Several things happened that year that broke something fundamental in Albert's spirit. First, his cousin and close friend Pedro V of Portugal died unexpectedly in November. Then his dear uncle Leopold, who'd been Albert's main supporter and advocate since childhood, died in December. These weren't just diplomatic losses. These were people Albert loved, people who'd made him feel less alone in the world. Their deaths hit him hard and reminded him of his own mortality, which he'd been carefully not thinking about despite his declining health. But the event that really destroyed Albert emotionally was the scandal with Bertie in the summer of 1861. Remember how we talked about Bertie, the heir who'd never been able to meet his father's expectations? Well, Bertie had just finished his first term at Cambridge, where Albert had sent him hoping that university would finally instill some intellectual seriousness. Instead, Bertie had pursued exactly the kinds of pleasures his father most disapproved of. Parties, drinking, gambling, and most scandalously, he'd had an affair with an actress named Nellie Clifton, who his fellow officers had arranged for him to meet during military training. When Albert found out about this in November 1861, he was absolutely devastated. This wasn't just disappointment in Bertie's behaviour, though there was plenty of that. This was Albert's worst nightmare coming true. He'd spent 20 years trying to shape Bertie into the perfect prince, the ideal future king who would embody moral virtue and take duty seriously. And Bertie had responded by having an affair with an actress, which in Victorian aristocratic society was not only morally scandalous, but politically dangerous. What if the woman got pregnant? What if she tried to blackmail the royal family? What if the scandal became public and damaged the monarchy's reputation? All the work Albert had done to make the British royal family respectable could be undermined by his son's inability to keep his affairs private. Albert's reaction was extreme enough that it suggests this was about more than just the immediate scandal. This was years of frustration and disappointment with Bertie erupting all at once. This was Albert confronting the reality that he'd failed as a father, at least by his own impossibly high standards. This was the man who believed he could fix anything with enough effort and education, realizing that he couldn't fix his own son. The psychological impact of this realization, combined with Albert's already fragile health and mental state, was crushing. He wrote Bertie a letter that was absolutely brutal in its criticism and disappointment. He essentially told Bertie that he'd destroyed his father's faith in him, that this behaviour was unforgivable, that Albert was ashamed to have such a son. Then, because Albert couldn't leave anything alone and had to try to fix problems even when he was too sick to be travelling, he went to Cambridge in late November to talk to Bertie in person. It was cold and rainy. Albert was already feeling ill. But he dragged himself to Cambridge for a long walk and conversation with Bertie, trying to impress upon his son the seriousness of his behaviour and the need to reform completely. The meeting didn't go well. Bertie was defensive and ashamed. Albert was disappointed and exhausted. They talked for hours in cold, wet weather, with Albert probably making himself significantly more ill in the process. Bertie promised to do better, which was what he always promised and rarely followed through on. Albert returned to Windsor feeling even worse than when he'd left, both physically and emotionally. The trip to Cambridge has gone down in history as potentially the moment that sealed Albert's fate, though the reality is that he was already seriously ill by that point. The Cambridge trip just accelerated a decline that was already well underway. Victoria blamed Bertie for making Albert sick, which was unfair but understandable from her perspective. She couldn't admit that maybe the real problem was the decades of overwork and stress, because that would implicate her in Albert's illness. Much easier to blame Bertie's scandalous behaviour for upsetting his father than to examine the larger pattern of how Albert had been slowly destroying himself with work. Bertie, already carrying enough guilt about disappointing his parents, now had the additional burden of being blamed for his father's declining health. The family dynamics were toxic in ways that would take decades to unpack. In early December 1861, Albert's condition worsened noticeably. He continued trying to work, because of course he did, but he was clearly struggling. He'd complain of feeling constantly cold even when others found the rooms comfortably warm. His stomach pain intensified. He had trouble concentrating on documents. He looked terrible, pale and drawn and exhausted. Doctors were consulted, multiple doctors with multiple theories and no real answers. Some thought it was gastric fever. Some thought it was influenza. Nobody quite knew what was wrong, and Victorian medical treatment for unclear illnesses basically involved making the patient comfortable and hoping they got better on their own. Victoria watched Albert deteriorate with growing panic. She still needed him to review papers and make decisions, so she'd prop him up and ask him questions even when he could barely focus. This sounds cruel written out like that, but it came from a place of desperate denial. If Albert was still working, he couldn't be that sick, right? If he was still giving her advice, things must be manageable. Victoria had spent her entire adult life depending on Albert for everything. The idea that he might actually be seriously ill, that she might lose him, was so terrifying that she simply couldn't process it. So she kept treating him like he was temporarily under the weather rather than dangerously sick. By mid-December, Albert was barely able to get out of bed. He was confused at times, drifting in and out of sleep, struggling to communicate clearly. The doctors started using the term typhoid fever, though their diagnosis was largely guessing based on symptoms. Typhoid was common enough in Victorian Britain, spread through contaminated water and poor sanitation. It was also frequently fatal, especially in patients who were already weakened by other health issues. The treatment was basically keeping the patient hydrated and comfortable, and hoping their immune system could fight off the infection. There were no antibiotics. There was no real medical intervention that could save someone with advanced typhoid. Victoria still didn't believe Albert was dying. She'd sit by his bed, hold his hand, talk to him about getting better and all the things they'd do once he recovered. Albert knew better. He'd lived through enough illnesses to recognise when recovery wasn't likely. But he couldn't bring himself to tell Victoria directly that he was dying, because that would destroy her and he wanted to protect her even at the end. So he'd listen to her talk about the future and occasionally squeeze her hand, and they both pretended that this was temporary even though they both probably knew it wasn't. The other children were kept mostly away from their father's sick room, which was standard practice for the era. You didn't expose children to serious illness if you could avoid it. But they knew something was terribly wrong. The household staff was sombre. Their mother was distraught. Their father, who had always been the strong, reliable centre of their family, was confined to bed and getting worse. The older children, particularly Vicky, who was now in Germany, received letters updating them on Albert's condition, but were too far away to visit. The younger children were simply told their father was ill and they needed to be quiet and well behaved. What makes Albert's death particularly tragic is how preventable it probably was. Not the typhoid itself necessarily, though better sanitation might have prevented that infection, but the overall decline, the vulnerability to serious illness, the complete exhaustion that made recovery impossible. If Albert had been able to pace himself better over the previous decade, if he'd taken real breaks and vacations, if he'd been able to say no to some of the endless demands on his time and energy, he might have been healthier and better able to fight off the infection. But that would have required a complete restructuring of his life and his relationship with Victoria and his sense of self-worth, and none of those changes were realistic given the circumstances. The medical care he received, while the best available at the time, was also basically useless. Doctors could diagnose typhoid, sort of, but they couldn't treat it effectively. They could make Albert comfortable with laudanum for pain, but they couldn't stop the disease from progressing. Victoria demanded constant medical updates and second opinions, bringing in additional doctors who all basically agreed on the diagnosis, but had no better treatment options. It must have been frustrating for everyone involved, all these educated medical professionals standing around essentially helpless while their patient died. There were moments in those final weeks when Albert seemed to rally, when his fever would drop and he'd seem more alert and Victoria would convince herself he was improving. Then he'd deteriorate again, and the cycle of hope and despair would repeat. This is apparently common with typhoid, these temporary improvements that don't actually indicate recovery. But for Victoria, each good day was proof that Albert was going to survive, and each bad day was a shock that required her to adjust her expectations all over again. The emotional whiplash must have been exhausting on top of everything else. Albert's mind wandered during the worst periods of fever. He'd talk about Germany, about his childhood, about hunting in the forests of Coburg. He was homesick even while dying in Windsor Castle surrounded by family. He'd mention his mother, who'd been exiled when he was 5 and who he'd never seen again. He was regressing psychologically, retreating to memories of a time before all the responsibility and pressure and constant work. Victoria would try to bring him back to the present, to remind him where he was and who was with him, but sometimes he'd look at her with confusion like he didn't quite recognise her. Those moments terrified Victoria more than anything else, seeing Albert mentally slip away even before his body gave out. The religious comfort that was supposed to help people through this kind of crisis didn't seem to help Albert much. He wasn't particularly devout in the conventional sense, though he'd always taken his religious duties seriously and believed in moral behaviour. But facing death, he didn't seem to find much solace in theology or promises of an afterlife. He was a practical man who'd spent his life trying to improve the material world, and death was the ultimate defeat, the end of all possibility for accomplishment and progress. That's got to be hard to accept when you're only 42 years old and had so many plans for what you wanted to achieve. Victoria's desperation during these final weeks was painful to witness, according to everyone who was there. She couldn't accept that the doctors couldn't do more. She kept asking for new treatments, new consultations, anything that might save Albert. She prayed constantly, making bargains with God that if Albert survived, she'd do whatever was asked of her. She'd rage at the doctors for their helplessness, then apologise and beg them to keep trying. She was watching the centre of her entire world disintegrate, and she had no power to stop it, which for someone who'd spent 2 decades as queen must have been particularly unbearable. The household staff tried to maintain some normalcy for the children, but that was basically impossible. The whole palace was holding its breath, waiting for either recovery or death, and everyone knew which was more likely at this point. Meals were subdued. Christmas preparations, which should have been happening since this was mid-December, were put on hold. Nobody wanted to celebrate while the prince was dying. Even the usual court business was suspended or handled minimally, because Victoria couldn't focus on anything except Albert's condition. Albert's final days in mid-December 1861 were a slow decline into unconsciousness. The fever wouldn't break. His breathing became laboured. He'd drift in and out of awareness, sometimes recognising the people around him, and sometimes not. Victoria stayed by his bedside almost constantly, leaving only when absolutely forced to for brief periods. She'd talk to him even when he couldn't respond, telling him how much she loved him, how much she needed him, how he had to fight and survive. Albert, when he was conscious enough to respond, would look at her with what witnesses described as infinite sadness, like he wanted to stay but knew he couldn't. The thing about Victorian attitudes toward death is that they expected people to die well, to have meaningful last words and peaceful endings and religious acceptance. Albert didn't really get that kind of exit. His death was messy and prolonged and mostly involved him being too fevered and exhausted to say much of anything profound. There was no dramatic deathbed scene where he gathered his family and dispensed final wisdom. There was just a sick man getting gradually weaker until his body gave up. It was sad and frustrating and completely lacking in the kind of dignity or meaning that death was supposed to have. The irony of Albert dying at 42, dying from a combination of overwork and infection, dying just when he'd finally achieved the respect and influence he'd spent 20 years building, is so thick you could cut it with a knife. This was a man who dedicated his life to progress, to improving conditions for other people, to building a better future. And he'd worked himself to death in the process, sacrificing his health and ultimately his life for causes that would continue without him. The very qualities that made him effective, his dedication and perfectionism and inability to do anything halfway, were the qualities that killed him. That's tragedy in the classical sense, where your strengths become your fatal flaws. Victoria's last conversation with Albert that she could remember clearly was on December 13th. He was lucid for a little while, and they talked quietly about various things. He told her to be kind to Bertie, which must have been difficult given how angry they both were at him. He mentioned some of his projects that he hoped would continue. He didn't explicitly say goodbye or tell Victoria he was dying, but the subtext was clear. They both knew this was probably the last real conversation they'd have. Victoria held his hand and told him she loved him, and Albert managed to squeeze back, and then he drifted off again and never fully regained consciousness after that. On December 14th, 1861, Albert's breathing became increasingly shallow and irregular. The doctors told Victoria that the end was near, which she refused to believe until it was actually happening. The family was called to the bedside. All the children who were available gathered around. The room was quiet except for Albert's laboured breathing and Victoria's occasional prayers or whispered words to her husband. And then, at 10:50 p.m. on December 14th, 1861, Albert died. Victoria later described his passing as peaceful, saying he just stopped breathing, no struggle or obvious pain. She let out a scream that was heard throughout the palace, a sound of grief so raw and desperate that witnesses never forgot it. The love of her life, her partner, her support system, the man she'd built her entire adult life around, was gone. And Victoria's life would never be the same. The morning of December 14th, 1861, started like most mornings at Windsor Castle in those final weeks of Albert's illness. Which is to say, it started with everyone pretending that maybe today would be different, that maybe Albert would somehow rally and recover despite all evidence pointing the other direction. The human capacity for denial is remarkable, and Victoria had been demonstrating that capacity at Olympic levels for the past month. She'd wake up, go to Albert's bedside and convince herself that he looked slightly better, that his breathing was easier, that his colour was improved. Then reality would reassert itself over the course of the day, and by evening she'd be back to panic and despair, only to start the cycle again the next morning. The household staff knew better. They'd seen enough serious illness to recognise when someone was dying, and Albert was clearly dying. The servants who brought meals that Albert couldn't eat, who changed bedding soaked with fever sweat, who emptied chamber pots and maintained the pretense that this was all routine medical care, they knew. The doctors knew, though they couldn't quite bring themselves to tell Victoria directly that her husband was beyond saving. The older children knew, at least the ones who were old enough to understand what they were seeing. but nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud, to make Victoria confront what she was desperately trying to ignore. December 14th was a Saturday. Not that the day of the week mattered much to anyone in Windsor Castle at that point. Time had become elastic and strange, measured not by clocks or calendars, but by the rhythm of Albert's breathing and the intervals between medical checks. Victoria had lost track of normal schedules. She'd sleep for an hour or two in a chair by Albert's bed, wake up disoriented, and not be entirely sure whether it was morning or afternoon. She'd stopped attending to government business almost entirely, which should have caused a constitutional crisis, but somehow didn't, because everyone was too focused on the personal tragedy to worry about politics. The weather that day was cold and grey, because of course it was. This is England in December, after all, and the universe wasn't going to provide cheerful sunshine for someone's deathbed. The castle was always slightly draughty, no matter how many fires they lit, and Albert kept complaining about being cold even when the room was warm enough that Victoria was uncomfortably hot in her heavy morning dress. She'd been wearing morning clothes since mid-November, theoretically for Albert's cousin Pedro, who'd died, but really because she was already preparing for the loss she couldn't admit was coming. Albert spent most of December 14th unconscious or semi-conscious. He'd open his eyes occasionally but didn't seem to focus on anything in particular. When doctors tried to get him to drink water or take medicine, he'd sometimes cooperate and sometimes just turn his head away like the effort was too much. His breathing had a rattling quality that the doctors recognised as a very bad sign, fluid in the lungs indicating that his body was shutting down. Victoria heard that sound every time she entered the room, and every time it sent a spike of terror through her, but she still couldn't quite believe it meant what everyone else knew it meant. The children were gathered at Windsor by this point, at least the ones who could get there quickly. Vicky was in Prussia and couldn't travel in time. But the others were present, kept mostly in separate rooms but allowed brief visits to their father's bedside. Bertie was there, carrying guilt so heavy it was visible in his posture and expression. He knew his parents blamed him for making Albert sick, even though that was medically nonsensical and emotionally unfair. Alice, who was 17 and had become incredibly mature and capable during this crisis, was helping manage her younger siblings and trying to support her mother. The younger children were frightened and confused, not fully understanding what was happening, but picking up on the general atmosphere of dread. The medical team on duty that day included several royal physicians, because when a prince is dying you bring in multiple doctors, even though none of them can actually do anything useful. They'd take Albert's pulse, check his temperature, examine him for changes in symptoms, and then consult with each other in serious tones that meant absolutely nothing, because they had no treatment options. Victorian medicine had decent diagnostic capabilities by this point. They could tell you exactly what was wrong with someone, give you detailed descriptions of the disease progression, predict with fair accuracy when death would occur. They just couldn't actually save you from most serious illnesses. It must have been incredibly frustrating to be a doctor in that era, watching patients die from conditions that modern medicine could treat with a round of antibiotics. Victoria's behaviour throughout the day was erratic in ways that showed how completely she was unravelling psychologically. She'd sit by Albert's bed holding his hand, whispering to him about their life together, reminding him of happy memories. Then she'd suddenly stand up and demand that the doctors do something, anything, to help him. She'd insist on changing his position in bed because maybe that would help him breathe easier. She'd adjust the curtains because maybe different lighting would wake him up properly. She'd send servants running for different medicines or treatments that someone had mentioned might be helpful. She was trying to control a situation that was completely beyond anyone's control, and the mismatch between her desperate actions and the reality of Albert's condition was painful to watch. There's a particular kind of helplessness that comes with watching someone you love die slowly. You want to do something, anything, to make it better. You want to believe that if you just try hard enough, if you just find the right solution, you can fix this. But death doesn't care about your efforts or your love or your desperate need for the person to survive. Death is the ultimate situation where being queen of the largest empire on earth gives you absolutely no advantage over anyone else. Victoria had more resources, more doctors, more money than almost anyone in the world. It made no difference at all. Albert was dying, and all her power and wealth and royal authority couldn't stop it. Around mid-afternoon, Albert seemed to become slightly more alert for a brief period. This was probably the phenomenon that doctors call terminal lucidity, where dying patients sometimes have a temporary period of clarity before the final decline. Victoria seized on this as proof that he was getting better, that the crisis had passed. She talked to him enthusiastically about Christmas preparations and what they'd do together once he recovered. Albert looked at her with an expression that witnesses described as infinitely sad, like he wanted to tell her the truth but couldn't bring himself to destroy her hope. He managed to squeeze her hand, which she interpreted as agreement and encouragement. What it probably actually was goodbye. After that brief period of alertness, Albert slipped back into deeper unconsciousness. His breathing became more laboured and irregular. The doctors, recognising the signs, quietly told Princess Alice that the end was near and the family should be summoned. Alice had to be the one to tell her mother, because none of the doctors wanted to face Victoria's reaction. She did it as gently as possible, but there's no gentle way to tell someone that their spouse is dying. Victoria's initial response was fury. How dare they suggest such a thing? Albert was improving. Hadn't they seen him wake up earlier? This was just another setback. He'd recover like he had before. Alice, who was 17 years old and somehow had to be the adult in this situation, insisted that the other children needed to say goodbye. Victoria finally, reluctantly, allowed the family to gather in Albert's bedroom. This is when the scene took on the quality of a Victorian deathbed tableau, the kind that would be painted in overly sentimental ways later, but in the moment was just desperately sad. The children arranged around the bed, Victoria holding Albert's hand, everyone watching and waiting for something to change, for some miracle that wasn't coming. Bertie approached his father's bedside with obvious terror and guilt. Albert was barely conscious at this point, but Bertie leaned down and said something that nobody else could hear, probably an apology or a plea for forgiveness. Whether Albert heard or understood is impossible to know. His face didn't change expression. Bertie stepped back, looking even more destroyed than before, and Victoria had to resist the urge to comfort her son because she was too focused on Albert to deal with Bertie's pain. The dynamic was complicated and messy, because of course it was. Real grief doesn't come with clear emotional priorities or the ability to handle everyone's needs at once. The doctors monitored Albert's vital signs throughout the evening, noting the gradual weakening of his pulse and the increasing irregularity of his breathing. They'd seen enough deaths to know these were the final stages. They quietly prepared Victoria for what was coming, though she still refused to fully accept it. She kept asking if there was anything else they could try, any other treatment, any possible intervention. The doctors had to keep gently explaining that no, there was nothing more to be done, they were sorry, they wished there was something they could do, but medical science had limits. This conversation played out multiple times over the course of the evening, with Victoria asking the same desperate questions and getting the same inadequate answers. As the evening progressed into night, the atmosphere in the room became increasingly tense and surreal. The fire in the fireplace crackled. Candles provided dim, flickering light. Albert's breathing was the loudest sound, each laboured inhale and exhale marking time in a way that made everyone painfully aware of how finite that time was. People spoke in whispers when they spoke at all. Servants came and went quietly, bringing tea that nobody drank and maintaining fires that couldn't make anyone feel warm. The younger children were taken away to bed at some point, because watching your father die all night is not considered appropriate for small children, even in an era that was more comfortable with death than ours. Victoria later wrote in her diary about these final hours with a detail that's almost painful to read. She described every change in Albert's breathing, every twitch of his hand, every moment when she thought he might be about to wake up. She wrote about how she prayed constantly, bargaining with God, promising anything if Albert could just survive. She wrote about the sound of the clock ticking, marking the minutes, how time felt like it was moving too fast and too slow simultaneously. She wrote about looking at Albert's face, memorizing every detail, trying to burn the image into her memory because some part of her knew this was the last time she'd see him alive. Around 10:30 p.m, Albert's breathing changed noticeably. It became very shallow and rapid, then would stop for long moments before starting again. This is called Cheyne-Stokes breathing, and it's a classic sign that death is imminent. The doctors recognised it immediately and looked at each other with grim knowledge. They didn't need to announce it. Everyone in the room understood what was happening. Victoria's grip on Albert's hand tightened. Alice stood close to her mother, ready to provide support. The other children who were present moved closer to the bed. Everyone was waiting, watching, hoping and dreading in equal measure. At 10:50 p.m. on December 14th, 1861, Albert took one final shallow breath and then simply stopped breathing. There was no dramatic final moment, no last words, no peaceful smile. He just stopped. The doctors checked for a pulse, found none, and confirmed what everyone already knew. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, Prince Consort to Queen Victoria, reformer of Britain, architect of the Great Exhibition, father of 9, husband for 21 years, was dead at 42 years old. The man who had changed an empire was gone, and the silence in the room after his last breath was absolute and terrible. Victoria's reaction was a scream that apparently echoed through the entire palace. Witnesses who wrote about it later described it as the most heartbreaking sound they'd ever heard, a sound of absolute despair and disbelief. She collapsed over Albert's body, sobbing, calling his name, begging him to wake up. She had to be physically pulled away by Alice and the doctors because she was clinging to him so tightly. She kept saying no, 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 like denial could somehow reverse what had just happened. The doctors had to give her some kind of sedative because she was hysterical, and the household staff who came running when they heard the scream had to be told that yes, it was over, the prince was dead, long live the grief that was about to reshape the monarchy. The immediate aftermath of Albert's death was chaos of a very British, very restrained sort, meaning people were absolutely falling apart inside but maintaining a veneer of propriety and efficiency on the outside. Servants immediately began the practical work of death. Albert's body needed to be prepared. The room needed to be arranged appropriately. Official notifications needed to be sent to family members, government officials, foreign courts. There were protocols for announcing the death of a royal, and those protocols needed to be followed even though everyone was emotionally devastated. The machinery of royal procedure kicked in because that's what happens when someone important dies. The personal tragedy becomes a public event, and private grief has to coexist with official mourning. Victoria was in no state to handle any of this. She was sedated, half-conscious, completely unable to function. Alice, 17 years old and suddenly the most capable person in the room, took charge of immediate arrangements. She made sure her younger siblings were informed gently. She authorized the official announcements. She dealt with doctors and servants and all the practical matters that needed handling. Princess Alice doesn't get enough credit in most historical accounts for basically keeping the royal family functioning in the immediate aftermath of Albert's death. She was a teenager who'd just lost her father and was watching her mother have a complete mental breakdown, and she somehow managed to stay calm and competent through all of it. The news of Albert's death spread through Windsor Castle within minutes and through London by morning. The telegraph system meant that word reached across Britain and then Europe with shocking speed compared to earlier eras when royal deaths took weeks to be announced everywhere. By the next day, newspapers across the country would have black-bordered front pages announcing the tragedy. By the next week, the entire British Empire would be in official mourning. But in those first hours after Albert's death, the grief was still private and raw and unprocessed. The public mourning would come later. This was the moment when reality was still sinking in for everyone who'd been close to Albert. Bertie's reaction to his father's death was particularly complex and painful. He was grieving, obviously, but he was also carrying the crushing weight of his mother's blame. Victoria had explicitly told him that his scandalous behaviour had killed Albert, that the stress of dealing with Bertie's affair had been too much for Albert's weakened constitution. This was medically absurd, of course. Albert was dying from typhoid and chronic overwork, not from emotional distress about his son's love life. But Victoria needed someone to blame besides herself and her own dependence on Albert, and Bertie was a convenient target. He'd spend the rest of his life trying to make up for supposedly killing his father, which is a hell of a burden to place on a 20-year-old who was already struggling with his parents' lifelong disappointment in him. The younger children were told about their father's death in age-appropriate ways, which meant they got heavily sanitized versions that emphasized he'd gone to heaven and was at peace now. They were too young to fully understand what they'd lost beyond the obvious fact that their father was gone. The long-term impact on them would only become clear over years and decades. Growing up without Albert's influence, growing up with a mother who was emotionally destroyed by grief, growing up in a household that had essentially frozen on December 14th, 1861, would shape all of them in profound ways. Victoria spent the first night after Albert's death in the room next to where his body lay. She couldn't sleep in their bed because Albert wasn't there. She couldn't leave him because being separated felt impossible. So she stayed close, in a kind of vigil that wasn't really about respecting the dead so much as refusing to accept that he was actually gone. She'd later say that she kept expecting to hear him call for her, that she couldn't believe he wouldn't wake up, that surely this was some terrible nightmare she'd escape from if she just tried hard enough. This is classic grief psychology, the denial stage where your brain just refuses to process reality because reality is too painful. The practical question that nobody wanted to ask but everyone was thinking about was, what happens now? Victoria was queen. She'd been queen for 24 years, but for the last 20 of those years, Albert had been doing a huge portion of the actual work of governing. He'd been reading state papers, drafting responses, meeting with ministers, handling correspondence, basically functioning as an unofficial co-monarch, even though he had no constitutional authority. Who was going to do all that work now? Victoria was in no condition to take it back on herself. She could barely function, barely think, barely get through each day. The idea of her reviewing government documents or making policy decisions was laughable. But the government had to continue functioning. Britain couldn't just stop being governed because the Queen was too grief-stricken to work. The Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, tried to visit Victoria to discuss government business and was turned away. She wouldn't see him. She wouldn't see anyone except her immediate family and a few trusted servants. Ministers would send urgent papers requiring royal signature, and they'd sit unread for days or weeks. Victoria simply could not engage with the responsibilities of her position. She'd lost not just her husband, but her chief advisor, her partner in governance, the person who had made her job manageable. Without Albert, she didn't know how to be queen anymore. Or maybe she just didn't want to be queen anymore, because being queen without Albert felt pointless. This is where we need to understand just how completely Victoria's identity had become intertwined with Albert over their 21 years of marriage. She wasn't just grieving a spouse, she was grieving the loss of half of herself. Everything she did, she'd done with Albert's support and advice. Every decision she made, she'd consulted him first. Every triumph she'd celebrated, he'd been there. Every failure she'd endured, he'd helped her handle it. Her entire adult life had been built around their partnership, and now, suddenly, catastrophically, she was alone. A 42-year-old widow ruling the largest empire on earth, with no idea how to function independently because she'd never had to do it before. The irony is that Victoria had spent the first 3 years of her reign desperately guarding her independence, refusing to let Albert into her political life, terrified that he'd try to control her. Then she'd spent the next 18 years becoming completely dependent on him, to the point where she couldn't imagine governing without him. She'd gone from one unhealthy extreme to another, and now she was paying the price. If she'd maintained some independence, if she'd kept some of her own decision-making power separate from Albert, maybe the loss wouldn't have been quite so devastating. But that's not how their relationship had evolved. They'd become a unit, Victoria and Albert, and with Albert gone, Victoria was cut in half and bleeding out emotionally. The physical presence of Albert's body in Windsor Castle for the days after his death was both a comfort and a torture for Victoria. She could go to him, sit by him, pretend for brief moments that he was just sleeping. But he was cold and still and obviously dead, and the pretense couldn't hold for long. The funeral preparations required moving the body eventually, and Victoria resisted this with everything she had. Moving Albert meant accepting that he was really gone, that this was permanent, that life would have to continue without him. She wasn't ready for that acceptance. She would never be ready for it. The state funeral would come later, with all the pomp and ceremony that Britain excels at providing for important deaths. But in those first days after December 14th, before the public mourning and official ceremony, there was just private devastation. A family torn apart, a woman destroyed by loss, children trying to make sense of a world without their father, servants grieving a prince who'd been kind to them, a nation slowly realizing that something fundamental had changed, even if they didn't yet understand the full implications. December 14th, 1861, was the day Victoria's life divided into before and after. Before Albert, when she was young and powerful and learning to be queen with his help. After Albert, when she would spend 40 years in mourning and fundamentally change how the British monarchy operated. That division point, that moment at 10:50 p.m. when Albert took his last breath, was when Victoria stopped being a functional monarch and became the widow queen, the woman who would wear black for the rest of her life, the woman who would turn mourning into a political statement and a personal obsession, the woman who would preserve Albert's memory so intensely that it would become almost pathological. But all of that was still in the future. On December 14th and in the immediate days following, Victoria was just a woman who'd lost the love of her life and didn't know how to survive the loss. She wasn't thinking about her legacy or how history would remember her or what her mourning would mean for the monarchy. She was just trying to breathe, to get through each moment, to somehow continue existing in a world that no longer contained Albert. The grief was fresh and raw and all-consuming. It would remain that way for longer than anyone could have imagined. Decades longer. Forever, really. Victoria would never truly recover from December 14th, 1861. She'd just learned to live with the wound, never healed, always present, defining everything she did for the rest of her life. The day the crown stopped wasn't actually the day Victoria stopped being queen. She'd continue ruling for another 40 years. But it was the day something essential broke inside her, something that had kept her functioning and engaged and present in her role. From December 14th, 1861, forward, Victoria would be ruling from a place of permanent damage. A queen who was also a widow, who was also a woman so consumed by grief that normal life became impossible. The empire would continue, the monarchy would continue, but Victoria, as she'd been before Albert's death, was gone. She'd been replaced by someone else, someone harder and more isolated and so focused on the past that the present barely seemed to matter. That transformation, from Victoria the active monarch who worked alongside Albert to Victoria the reclusive widow who governed from behind black veils and closed doors, began at 10:50 p.m. on December 14th, 1861. That was when her scream echoed through Windsor Castle, and everyone who heard it knew that something irreparable had happened. Not just the death of a prince, though that was tragic enough, but the death of a partnership that had defined an era. The death of Victoria's ability to be the kind of queen she'd been with Albert by her side. The death, in some very real sense, of the Victorian era as people had known it, even though Victoria would live and reign for another 40 years. The immediate aftermath of Albert's death was just the beginning of a much longer story about grief and memory, and how one woman's refusal to move on would shape an empire. But you had to understand that first night, that first moment when Victoria realised Albert was truly gone, to understand everything that came after. The intensity of her reaction, the completeness of her devastation, the way she couldn't imagine continuing without him. That wasn't just Victorian sentimentality or dramatic royal behaviour. That was genuine, profound loss experienced by someone who'd built her entire life around another person and suddenly found that foundation gone. What do you do when the person who gave your life meaning dies? How do you keep going when the reason you got up every morning no longer exists? These are questions Victoria would spend the next 40 years trying to answer, and the answers she came up with would be fascinating and troubling and ultimately definitive of who she became. But it all started on December 14th, 1861, with that scream in the night and the terrible silence that followed. So Victoria's husband was dead, she was completely unable to function, and she happened to be the Queen of England, which created some logistical problems. The nation needed governance. Parliament needed royal approval for legislation. Foreign affairs required diplomatic attention, but Victoria couldn't even get out of bed most days, let alone handle the responsibilities of ruling an empire. In the weeks and months after Albert's death, she essentially stopped being queen in any active sense. She retreated from public life so completely that for a while there was genuine concern about whether she'd ever re-emerge. The first decision Victoria made in her grief was simple and absolute. She would wear black for the rest of her life. Not metaphorically black, literally black. Every dress, every piece of fabric, every accessory, all black. This was taking Victorian mourning customs and turning them up to 11. The standard mourning period for a widow was 2 years, which already seemed excessive by most people's standards. Victoria decided that 2 years was nowhere near enough. She'd mourn forever, and she did. For the next 40 years, until her death in 1901, Victoria wore nothing but black. She became a living monument to grief, a walking reminder that Albert was gone and nothing would ever be right again. The visual impact of this was striking, and not in a good way. Victoria was a relatively short woman, under 5 feet tall, and she was already inclined toward plumpness. Dressed entirely in black, with black veils and black jewellery and absolutely no colour anywhere, she looked less like a powerful monarch and more like a particularly depressed tea cosy. The photographs from this period show a woman who seems to have given up on everything except maintaining her grief. Her expression is grim, her posture is heavy, her entire presence screams, "I am suffering, and I want everyone to know it." This was not exactly inspiring imagery for the head of the British Empire, but Victoria wasn't trying to look inspiring, she was trying to look bereaved. She wanted everyone who saw her to remember Albert, to understand what had been lost, to share in her mourning. The black clothes were a constant visual reminder that the Queen was a widow, and that her widowhood was the most important thing about her. More important than being Queen, more important than her remaining children. More important than any of her responsibilities or obligations. Victoria had decided that her identity was now Queen Victoria, Albert's widow, and everything else was secondary. The second decision Victoria made was that Albert's rooms would remain exactly as they were on the day he died. His bedroom, his dressing room, his study, all preserved as shrines to his memory. This is where things started getting genuinely weird in ways that go beyond normal grief into obsessive territory. Every day, servants were instructed to lay out Albert's clothes as if he were still alive and getting dressed. Every evening they had to bring fresh hot water for shaving and place it in his dressing room, even though there was obviously no one there to use it. His papers on his desk had to stay in exactly the same arrangement. Nothing could be moved or changed or cleaned too thoroughly, because that would disturb the sacred space. Imagine being a servant assigned to this duty. Every day you go into a dead man's room and perform tasks for someone who isn't there and will never be there again. You pour hot water that will go cold and be thrown out unused. You arrange clothes that no one will wear. You dust around papers that no one will read. This is not normal mourning behaviour. This is the kind of thing that in a Gothic novel would be a sign that someone has completely lost their grip on reality. But this was the Queen of England's orders, so the servants did it, probably while exchanging worried glances with each other and wondering if someone should stage an intervention. Victoria also started sleeping with Albert's nightshirt under her pillow and a plaster cast of his hand on her bedside table. Because when your husband dies, the healthy response is obviously to create a creepy shrine in your bedroom and surround yourself with inanimate objects that remind you of his physical presence. She'd kiss the plaster hand before going to sleep. She'd hold the nightshirt and cry herself to sleep. She had photographs of Albert's body in his coffin taken and kept them with her, which was actually somewhat normal for the Victorian era, but is still deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities. The Victorians had a whole culture around death photography and memorial objects, but Victoria took it to extremes that made even her contemporaries uncomfortable. Her insistence on preserving Albert's memory extended far beyond her private rooms. Victoria decided that Britain needed monuments to Albert, lots of monuments, everywhere. The most famous is the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, which is basically a Gothic temple to one man's greatness designed by George Gilbert Scott. It's 176 feet tall, covered in sculptures and mosaics and decorative elements, and features a giant gilded statue of Albert sitting under an ornate canopy, holding a catalogue from the Great Exhibition. Subtle it is not. The memorial cost over £120,000, which in modern money would be well over £10 million. This was not a modest tribute. This was Victoria screaming Albert was important, and you will remember him in stone and bronze and gold leaf forever. Then there was the Royal Albert Hall, which opened in 1871 and was supposed to be a monument to Albert's love of arts and sciences. It's a massive concert venue that seats 5,000 people and hosts everything from classical music to rock concerts to tennis matches. The name is literally Central Hall of Arts and Sciences, but everyone called it the Albert Hall because Victoria insisted his name be prominently associated with it. She'd initially wanted it to be called the Central Hall of Arts and Sciences in memory of the Prince Consort, but that was too long for anyone to actually use, so Albert Hall it became. Victoria attended the opening and apparently broke down crying because seeing this monument to Albert was both comforting and devastatingly sad. She also insisted that basically every new public building, every new institution, every new project had to somehow honour Albert's memory. Schools were named after him, hospitals were named after him, bridges, parks, museums, you name it. If something was being built during Victoria's reign, and she had any influence over it at all, it was going to have Albert in the name or at least a plaque mentioning him. This was partly genuine grief and partly very savvy political strategy. By tying Albert's name to everything associated with progress and improvement, Victoria was cementing his reputation as a reformer and visionary. She was making sure history would remember him the way she wanted him remembered. Victoria also published everything Albert had ever written: speeches, letters, essays, random thoughts he'd jotted down, all of it collected and published with elaborate introductions by Victoria explaining how brilliant and far-sighted he'd been. Some of this material was genuinely interesting and valuable. Albert had been thoughtful and intelligent, and his writings on education and social reform were worth preserving. But some of it was incredibly boring administrative correspondence that only got published because Victoria couldn't bear the thought of any of Albert's words being lost to history. She was determined that future generations would have access to Albert's complete thoughts on everything from army reform to the proper way to manage royal estates. The most extensive of these publishing projects was a multi-volume collection called The Principal Speeches and Addresses of His Royal Highness the Prince Consort, which is exactly what it sounds like. Every public speech Albert ever gave, meticulously transcribed and annotated, published in expensive leather-bound editions. Victoria wrote lengthy introductions for these volumes explaining the context of various speeches and how they demonstrated Albert's genius. Modern historians are actually grateful for this obsessive record-keeping because it provides excellent source material for understanding Albert's work and influence. But the motivation wasn't historical preservation. It was Victoria's desperate need to keep Albert alive through his words, since she couldn't keep him alive literally. Her relationship with her children during this period was complicated and often painful for everyone involved. Victoria essentially expected her children to grieve as intensely as she did, forever. She couldn't understand why they weren't as completely destroyed by Albert's death as she was. When her children tried to move on with their lives, get married, have careers, be happy, Victoria viewed this as betrayal. How dare you be happy when Albert is dead? How dare you think about the future when the past is all that matters? She'd guilt-trip her children constantly, reminding them how wonderful their father was, how much they owed him, how they'd never measure up to his standards. Bertie got the worst of this, unsurprisingly. Victoria blamed him for Albert's death and never let him forget it. She refused to give him any meaningful responsibilities or include him in government business, because in her mind he'd killed his father and therefore didn't deserve trust or respect. Bertie was the heir to the throne, but Victoria treated him like he was an irresponsible child who couldn't be trusted with anything important. This went on for decades. Even when Bertie was in his 50s with his own children, Victoria still saw him as the disappointment who'd caused Albert's death. The psychological damage this did to Bertie was immense and permanent. Her daughters fared somewhat better, but not by much. Alice stayed close and helped care for Victoria in the immediate aftermath of Albert's death, but Victoria's constant demands for emotional support eventually wore her down. Louise tried to develop her own identity as an artist, and was criticised by Victoria for not being sufficiently devoted to Albert's memory. Beatrice, the youngest, essentially had her entire life sacrificed to Victoria's needs. Victoria decided that Beatrice would never marry, never leave, never have her own life. She'd stay with her mother and provide company and support forever. When Beatrice did eventually marry, Victoria was so upset that she refused to speak to her daughter for months. The marriage was only permitted if Beatrice and her husband continued living with Victoria, which they did, for years. This is not healthy family dynamics, to put it mildly. The British public's reaction to Victoria's extended mourning was mixed. At first, there was genuine sympathy. Prince Albert had been popular by the end of his life, and people understood that Victoria was grieving. But as months turned into years and Victoria showed no signs of returning to her public duties, sympathy started turning into criticism. The Queen was being paid a substantial income from the public treasury. People expected her to actually perform the functions of monarchy in return, attending state events, opening Parliament, showing herself to the public, doing the ceremonial work that made monarchy visible and relevant. Victoria refused to do almost all of this. She'd sign necessary documents in private, but public appearances were too painful because they reminded her that Albert wasn't there. By the late 1860s and early 1870s, there was serious Republican sentiment in Britain. Newspapers published editorials asking what exactly the country was paying Victoria for if she refused to do her job. Politicians debated whether the monarchy was even necessary if the monarch was going to hide away and never be seen. There were public meetings calling for Britain to become a republic and abolish the monarchy entirely. This was not idle chatter. This was a genuine political movement that had real support. Victoria's extended mourning was putting the entire institution of monarchy at risk, and she either didn't notice or didn't care. Her prime ministers during this period had the unenviable task of trying to convince Victoria to return to public life, while also respecting her grief. Benjamin Disraeli, who served as Prime Minister twice during Victoria's widowhood, was particularly skilled at managing her. He'd write her flattering letters about how much the nation needed her, how only she could provide the stability and leadership Britain required, how Albert would have wanted her to continue their work together. Disraeli understood that Victoria responded better to emotional appeals than to demands or criticism. His strategy of gentle manipulation eventually convinced Victoria to make at least some public appearances, though she never fully returned to the level of public engagement she'd maintained before Albert's death. The thing about Victoria's mourning that made it different from normal grief was its performative quality. She wasn't just sad in private, she was sad publicly, dramatically, and constantly. She wanted everyone to see her suffering, to acknowledge it, to validate it. The black clothes, the preserved rooms, the monuments, the published works, these were all ways of making sure nobody forgot that Victoria had lost Albert, and that loss defined everything about her. This was grief as public theatre, grief as political statement, grief as identity. And while there was genuine emotion underlying all of it, there was also something calculated about how Victoria wielded her widowhood. By making Albert into a saint, a perfect prince who'd been too good for this world, Victoria was also legitimising her own rule and her own choices. If Albert had been this incredible visionary, and Albert had worked closely with Victoria, then Victoria's policies and decisions were by extension blessed by Albert's wisdom. She could justify any political position by claiming it was what Albert would have wanted. She could shut down criticism by asking, "How dare you question the judgment of Albert's widow, who knew his mind better than anyone?" The cult of Albert's memory became a shield Victoria used to protect herself from accountability. This strategy worked surprisingly well. By the 1870s and 1880s, Albert's reputation had been thoroughly rehabilitated from the suspicious German prince nobody wanted to the beloved reformer who'd modernised Britain. This was largely Victoria's doing, her relentless campaign to ensure Albert was remembered as a hero. And because Albert was now universally respected, Victoria benefited from that respect by association. She was the widow of the great Prince Albert, carrying on his legacy, faithful to his memory. This gave her a kind of moral authority that she might not have had otherwise. The mourning that had started as personal grief had become a successful political brand. But the cost of this 40-year mourning period was Victoria's own happiness and well-being. She never really lived after Albert died. She existed. She functioned minimally. She went through the motions. But joy, pleasure, genuine engagement with life, all of that was gone. She'd decided that being happy would be disloyal to Albert's memory, so she chose to be miserable instead. This is not what grief is supposed to look like. Healthy grief involves mourning, and then gradually learning to live again, finding new meaning, rebuilding your life. Victoria refused to do any of that. She picked a point in time, December 14th, 1861, and decided to live there forever, never moving forward, never healing, never allowing herself to be anything except Albert's grieving widow. Her grandchildren, who were born after Albert died, grew up knowing him only through Victoria's obsessive stories and the omnipresent monuments. To them, Albert wasn't a real person. He was a mythical figure, Grandmama's dead husband who had apparently been perfect in every way and whose memory dominated every family gathering. They'd visit Balmoral Castle in Scotland, which Victoria and Albert had designed together, and it was like a shrine to the past. Albert's things were still where he'd left them. His portrait was in every room. Victoria would talk about him constantly, telling stories about what he'd said or done, what he'd wanted, what he'd believed. The grandchildren learned quickly not to say anything that might be interpreted as critical of Albert, because that would make Grandmama either furious or dissolve into tears, and neither option was pleasant. The daily rituals Victoria maintained around Albert's memory were extensive and time-consuming. She'd visit his private rooms daily. She'd read through his papers and letters. She'd look at photographs and weep. She'd talk to his bust and his portrait as if he could hear her. She'd write in her diary about how much she missed him, how everything reminded her of him, how life without him was unbearable. This went on every single day for 40 years. The same rituals, the same mourning, the same refusal to move forward. It's actually quite sad when you think about it. This woman who'd once been so vital and engaged with the world, reducing herself to a monument to someone else's memory. Victoria did eventually start doing more public appearances in the 1870s and 1880s, largely because Disraeli convinced her, and because the alternative was possibly losing the monarchy entirely. She attended the opening of Parliament, though she refused to wear the official robes and crown, instead appearing in her black mourning dress with a small crown. She participated in her Golden and Diamond Jubilees, which celebrated 50 and 60 years of her reign. But even these public appearances were framed around her widowhood. She was doing this for Albert, carrying on his legacy, honouring his memory by continuing to serve as Queen. She couldn't just be Queen Victoria, she had to be Queen Victoria, Albert's widow. The preservation of Albert's rooms continued unchanged until Victoria's death. For 40 years, servants maintained the fiction that Albert might return at any moment. The hot water for shaving, the laid-out clothes, the undisturbed papers. It became such an established routine that new servants who were hired years after Albert's death would be trained in these duties without questioning why they were doing them. That's just how things are done in the royal household. You bring hot water to a dead prince's room every evening because the Queen requires it. The absurdity of this apparently never occurred to anyone, or if it did, they wisely kept it to themselves. Victoria also commissioned numerous portraits and sculptures of Albert, adding to the visual cult of his memory. Every royal residence had to have multiple images of Albert in prominent positions. Paintings, busts, photographs, statues. You couldn't walk through a royal building without encountering Albert's face multiple times. This ensured that no one could forget him, but it also created an atmosphere that was somewhere between reverent memorial and creepy obsession. Visitors to the royal residences commented on how strange it was to be constantly surrounded by images of a man who'd been dead for decades, while his widow sat in black mourning clothes talking about him in the present tense. The question that historians and biographers have debated ever since is whether Victoria's mourning was genuine grief that lasted unusually long, or whether it became something else over time. In the immediate aftermath of Albert's death, her devastation was clearly real. She'd lost the person she loved most in the world, and the shock and pain were overwhelming. But 40 years? 4 decades of black clothes and preserved rooms and daily rituals of mourning? At some point, grief becomes identity. Victoria's widowhood became who she was, and letting go of that identity would have meant losing her connection to Albert entirely. She chose to stay in her grief because it kept her connected to him, even if that connection was based on pain rather than joy. There's also the question of whether Victoria's mourning was made worse by the fact that she'd been so dependent on Albert. If she'd maintained more independence during their marriage, if she'd kept her own identity separate from their partnership, maybe the loss wouldn't have been quite so devastating. But she'd built her entire life around him. She'd let him take over huge portions of her work as queen. She'd made him her emotional centre, her support system, her reason for everything. When he died, she didn't just lose her husband. She lost her identity, her purpose, her ability to function as the person she'd been. The grief was amplified by the fact that she'd made herself completely unable to exist without him. The impact of Victoria's 40-year mourning on the British monarchy was significant and lasting. She fundamentally changed what it meant to be a British monarch. Before Victoria, monarchs were expected to be public figures, visible and active in ways that demonstrated their power and importance. After Victoria's withdrawal from public life, there was more acceptance of the idea that monarchs could be more private, more removed from day-to-day public engagement. This set a precedent that later monarchs would both benefit from and struggle with. The question of how much the royal family should engage with the public versus maintain private lives is still being debated today, and it traces back partly to Victoria's example of prolonged mourning and retreat from public view. Victoria's relationship with her children and grandchildren was permanently altered by her extended mourning. They couldn't have normal relationships with her because everything was filtered through her grief. Every family celebration was shadowed by the fact that Albert wasn't there. Every decision had to be made with consideration for what Albert would have wanted, as interpreted by Victoria, who was the sole authority on Albert's opinions since he was inconveniently dead and couldn't speak for himself. This created a family dynamic where the dead parent was more influential than the living one, which is psychologically unhealthy for everyone involved. The memorials Victoria built, the work she published, the monuments she commissioned, these things did preserve Albert's memory and ensure his contributions to British society were recognised. Without Victoria's obsessive memorialising, Albert might have been largely forgotten by history, just another prince consort who held no official power. Instead, he's remembered as a significant figure in Victorian Britain, a reformer and visionary whose influence shaped the era. So in that sense, Victoria's project worked. She made Albert immortal through memory. But the cost was her own life, her own happiness, her own potential to grow and change and be something more than just Albert's grieving widow. By the time Victoria died in 1901 at the age of 81, she'd been widowed for 40 years, more than half of her 63-year reign. She'd worn black for 40 years. She'd maintained Albert's rooms unchanged for 40 years. She'd mourned publicly and privately and constantly for 40 years. When she finally died, her instructions specified that she was to be buried wearing her white wedding veil and with Albert's dressing gown beside her in the coffin. Even in death, she was defining herself by her relationship to Albert. She was Queen Victoria, yes, but more importantly, she was Albert's wife, and she wanted to be reunited with him more than she wanted anything else. The funeral arrangements she'd left instructions for were telling. She wanted to be buried next to Albert in the royal mausoleum at Frogmore, which she'd built specifically for this purpose. The mausoleum was another monument to Albert, elaborate and expensive, designed to be their eternal resting place together. Victoria had visited it regularly during her life, talking to Albert's tomb as if he could hear her. Now she'd finally join him permanently, which was what she'd been wanting for 40 years. The only thing that had kept her alive for so long was her sense of duty and her desire to preserve Albert's legacy. Once those tasks were complete, she was ready to go. The legacy of Victoria and Albert's relationship is complicated by those 40 years of mourning. On one hand, their love story is genuinely moving. They found each other despite difficult childhoods, built a genuine partnership despite early conflicts, accomplished remarkable things together. On the other hand, Victoria's inability to move on after Albert's death, her refusal to live her own life, her transformation of grief into identity, that's troubling. It suggests that maybe their relationship wasn't as healthy as it appeared, that Victoria's dependence on Albert was actually a weakness that destroyed her ability to function independently. But maybe that's too harsh. Maybe Victoria's 40 years of mourning was just love taking a form we find uncomfortable. She loved Albert so completely that losing him broke something in her that never healed. She couldn't imagine being happy without him, so she chose to be perpetually sad with his memory. She couldn't move forward into a future without him, so she lived in the past where he still existed. It's not how most people would choose to grieve, but it was her choice, and in some strange way it worked for her. She kept Albert alive through memory, made sure the world never forgot him, and maintained her connection to him through 4 decades of devoted mourning. The story of Victoria and Albert doesn't end with his death in 1861. It ends with her death in 1901, still wearing black, still mourning, still defining herself primarily as his widow. Those 40 years are part of their story, because they demonstrate just how deep their connection had been. You don't mourn someone for 4 decades unless they meant absolutely everything to you. Victoria's grief, excessive and obsessive as it was, proved that their love had been real, that their partnership had been genuine, that what they built together had mattered immensely. Albert had died, but their relationship continued in Victoria's memory and devotion, until she finally joined him in death. So here we are, more than a century and a half after Albert died, and more than 120 years after Victoria finally joined him. The British Empire they ruled over is long gone, dissolved into history and replaced by the Commonwealth, which is basically the Empire's polite retirement plan. The Victorian era itself has become shorthand for a whole complicated set of attitudes and behaviours that we often misunderstand or oversimplify. But Victoria and Albert themselves, their relationship, their love story, their partnership, that's still here, still being talked about. Still influencing how we think about monarchy, marriage, and the possibility of combining duty with genuine affection, which is either romantic or slightly weird depending on your perspective, but either way, it's remarkable. Let's start with the physical legacy, because that's the most obvious and the easiest to see if you happen to be in London or anywhere else in Britain, where Victoria went on her monument-building spree. The Royal Albert Hall is still there in Kensington, still hosting concerts and events, still one of the most famous performance venues in the world. You can go there today and watch the BBC Proms or a rock concert or the Cirque du Soleil, and you're doing it in a building that exists because Victoria loved her husband so much she needed to immortalise him in brick and iron and glass. The acoustics are actually kind of terrible in parts of the hall because the Victorians didn't fully understand how sound works in large circular spaces, but nobody cares because the building itself is so impressive that bad acoustics just add character. The Albert Memorial sits across the street in Kensington Gardens, still gleaming with gold leaf, still absolutely over the top in its Gothic extravagance. It's the kind of monument that makes modern memorial designers weep with envy because nobody gets budgets like that anymore. The statue of Albert holding the catalogue from the Great Exhibition sits under its ornate canopy, looking out over the park, eternally preserved in bronze and gold as the perfect prince consort. Pigeons have been using it as a bathroom for over a century, which is probably not the dignified eternal rest Victoria had in mind. But that's what happens when you build outdoor monuments in a city with an aggressive pigeon population. Then there's the Victoria and Albert Museum, the V&A, which is one of the world's great museums of art and design. It houses over 2.3 million objects spanning 5,000 years of human creativity, from ancient sculpture to contemporary fashion. The museum exists because profits from Albert's Great Exhibition were used to establish educational and cultural institutions in South Kensington. This was Albert's vision made permanent, the idea that art and design and culture should be accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy elite. The fact that you can walk into the V&A today for free and spend hours looking at incredible objects from around the world is a direct result of Albert's belief that education and culture could improve society. That's a legacy that actually matters. There are also streets named after them, squares named after them, buildings named after them, all across Britain and in various former colonies. Melbourne, Australia, is named after Lord Melbourne, Victoria's first Prime Minister, but the state of Victoria is named after the Queen herself. There's a Lake Albert and a Prince Albert in Saskatchewan, Canada, the Albert Bridge in London, the Victoria Falls in Africa, named by David Livingstone, Victoria Peak in Hong Kong. The list goes on and on. They stamped their names across the map of the world in ways that outlasted the empire itself. Most of these places have no idea who the historical figures behind the names actually were, but the names persist anyway, fossils of an era when Britain thought it owned half the planet and wasn't shy about labelling everything accordingly. The cultural legacy is even more interesting and far-reaching than the physical monuments. White wedding dresses, for instance. That's Victoria's doing. She wore white when she married Albert in 1840, and because everyone paid attention to what the Queen wore, white became fashionable for brides. Before Victoria, brides wore their best dress in whatever colour they liked. After Victoria, white became traditional, then expected, then basically mandatory in Western weddings. This tradition has persisted for almost 200 years now, and most brides wearing white today have no idea they're following a trend started by a 20-year-old queen who just thought white looked nice with her lace. Christmas trees are another Victoria and Albert import. Well, technically they were already a German tradition and were introduced to Britain earlier, but Victoria and Albert popularised them by having their Christmas trees illustrated in newspapers and magazines. The images of the royal family gathered around a decorated tree, exchanging gifts and celebrating together, created a template for how Christmas should look that we still follow today. The idea of Christmas as a family holiday centred around a decorated tree with presents underneath. That's partly Victoria and Albert's influence. They turned a German custom into a British tradition that then spread across the English-speaking world. So when you're cursing at tangled Christmas lights or vacuuming up pine needles in January, you can thank Victoria and Albert for that experience. More broadly, they shaped the modern ideal of the royal family as a model for domestic virtue and family values. Before Victoria and Albert, the British royal family was frankly kind of a mess. George III went mad. George IV was a debauched spendthrift who hated his wife. William IV had 10 illegitimate children with an actress. The monarchy's reputation was not great. Victoria and Albert presented a completely different image, a loving married couple who were devoted to their children and took their responsibilities seriously. They made the monarchy respectable again, turned it into an institution that middle-class Victorians could look up to as an example of how families should function. The irony, of course, is that their actual family life was considerably more dysfunctional than the public image suggested. The pressure they put on their children, the impossible expectations, the emotional damage they inflicted, that wasn't part of the carefully curated public persona. But the image of the royal family as paragons of virtue and domestic bliss that stuck. It became the template that later British monarchs would try to live up to, with varying degrees of success. The idea that royalty should be both majestic and relatable, both above the common people and somehow representative of their values, that's a tightrope walk that Victoria and Albert pioneered. They also changed how monarchs were expected to behave in terms of public service and social responsibility. Before Albert, British royalty mostly focused on ceremony, tradition, and maintaining their own privileges. Albert brought this German idea that nobility came with obligations, that if you had wealth and power, you should use it to benefit society. His work on education reform, public health, housing for workers, military reform, all of that established a precedent that royalty could and should be a force for social progress. Modern royal family members doing charity work, supporting causes, using their platform to draw attention to social issues, that traces back to Albert's example. The political legacy is more complicated and, honestly, kind of tragic. Victoria and Albert's dynastic strategy of marrying their children into royal families across Europe did technically succeed. By the early 20th century, Victoria's descendants were ruling or married into ruling families in Britain, Germany, Russia, Spain, Romania, Greece, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. She really was the grandmother of Europe, with relatives on pretty much every significant throne. This was supposed to create a network of family ties that would prevent war and promote cooperation. Instead, it meant that World War I was essentially a massive family civil war. King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all grandchildren of Victoria. They were cousins who'd grown up together, attended the same family gatherings, corresponded regularly, and then their countries went to war with each other, and the family connections did absolutely nothing to prevent the catastrophe. Wilhelm and George looked remarkably similar, so much so that they could have been brothers. They were on opposite sides of a war that killed millions of people. The Christmas truces on the Western Front, where soldiers from different armies briefly stopped fighting to celebrate together, are poignant partly because the men in those trenches were often dying for countries ruled by monarchs who were literally related to each other. The dynastic marriages also spread haemophilia through the royal families of Europe, because Victoria was a carrier of the gene, and several of her children inherited it or became carriers themselves. Her son Leopold died at 30 from a bleeding incident. Multiple grandchildren had haemophilia, including Alexei, the son of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Alexei's illness and the family's desperate attempts to treat it played a role in the rise of Rasputin and the eventual fall of the Russian monarchy. So Victoria's genes didn't just spread her descendants across Europe. They spread a genetic disorder that caused suffering and potentially influenced historical events. That's probably not the legacy she'd hoped to leave, but biology doesn't care about your dynastic ambitions. The Russian royal family's fate is particularly tragic given their connection to Victoria. Tsar Nicholas II was married to Alexandra, Victoria's granddaughter. They and their children were executed by Bolsheviks in 1918, victims of the Russian Revolution. Alexandra carried letters from her grandmother Victoria until the end, kept photographs of the British royal family, maintained that connection to her heritage even as everything fell apart around her. The last letters between Victoria's descendants in the Russian and British royal families, written as the Russian monarchy collapsed, are heartbreaking to read. These were family members trying to save each other and failing, watching the world they'd been born into completely disintegrate. Many of the European monarchies that Victoria's descendants ruled or married into eventually fell. The German monarchy ended after World War I. The Russian monarchy ended in revolution and murder. The Greek monarchy went through multiple upheavals. The Romanian monarchy was abolished by communists. By the mid-20th century, most of the crowns that Victoria's grandchildren had worn were gone. The British monarchy survived, partly through luck and partly through successful adaptation, but the grand vision of a united Europe ruled by Victoria's descendants was thoroughly destroyed by the wars and revolutions of the 20th century. But here's what did survive and what matters more than thrones and dynasties. Victoria and Albert changed how we think about love and marriage, particularly in the context of public life and power. Before them, royal marriages were understood to be political arrangements, and everyone accepted this. Nobody expected kings and queens to love their spouses. Nobody thought personal happiness had anything to do with dynastic duty. Marriage was about alliances, about producing heirs, about property and power. Love was something you might be lucky enough to find on the side with a mistress or lover, but it had nothing to do with your actual spouse. Victoria and Albert proved that this didn't have to be true. They showed that it was possible to have a marriage that was both a political partnership and a genuine love match. They demonstrated that duty and personal happiness weren't mutually exclusive, that you could fulfill your public responsibilities while also building a private life that brought you joy. This seems obvious now, but in 1840 it was actually kind of revolutionary. The idea that the most powerful woman in the world could be openly, obviously, passionately in love with her husband, and that this was not only acceptable but actually admirable, that changed something fundamental in how Western culture thought. About marriage, their relationship proved that partnership could be a source of strength rather than weakness. Victoria was a better queen because she had Albert's support and advice. Albert found purpose and meaning by working alongside Victoria. They accomplished more together than either could have managed alone. This model of marriage as partnership, as two people supporting each other and making each other better, that's something we take for granted now but was genuinely novel in the context of royal marriages in the 1840s. The Victorians invented a lot of things we associate with modernity, from trains to telegraphs to photography. Maybe their most important invention was the idea that royal marriage could be based on love without sacrificing duty. The public nature of their affection also mattered. They didn't hide their feelings for each other. They held hands in public, stood close together, looked at each other with obvious warmth and attraction. Victoria wrote openly in her published journals about how much she loved Albert. They created a narrative of their relationship that was accessible to the public, that people could observe and relate to even though they were royalty, and therefore fundamentally different from ordinary people. This transparency made monarchy more human and relatable. It suggested that queens and princes had emotions and relationships that weren't so different from everyone else's, that the institution of a monarchy was compatible with recognizable human feeling. The tragedy of their story, Albert's early death and Victoria's 40 years of mourning, actually reinforced this emotional connection with the public. Victoria's grief was so visible and so extreme that it made her vulnerable in ways that monarchs usually weren't. People could see that she was genuinely destroyed by losing Albert, that her feelings were real and profound. This created sympathy even among people who were frustrated by her withdrawal from public life. She became relatable through her suffering. The Queen, who'd once seemed distant and powerful, was revealed to be a woman capable of profound love and devastating loss, just like anyone else who'd lost a spouse. Victoria's insistence that their love never died, that Albert was still with her in spirit and memory, that she was still his wife even decades after his death, this created a narrative of eternal love that resonated with Victorian sentimentality and continues to resonate today. We like stories about love that transcends death. We want to believe that genuine connection persists beyond mortality. Victoria gave us that story in dramatic, excessive, impossible-to-ignore ways. The 40 years of mourning while psychologically unhealthy made for an incredibly powerful love story. She loved him so much that losing him destroyed her capacity for normal life. That's romantic in a gothic, tragic sort of way that appeals to something deep in how we think about love. The letters and diaries that Victoria published, the intimate details she shared about her relationship with Albert, these created a historical record of a royal love story that people could actually access and understand. We know what Victoria thought about Albert's attractiveness. We know what Albert wrote to Victoria about missing her when they were apart. We have their arguments and their reconciliations and their private jokes documented in their own words. This level of intimate detail is unusual for any historical figures and almost unprecedented for royalty. Victoria's need to preserve every aspect of Albert's memory and their relationship together gave historians and the public access to the emotional reality of their partnership in ways that make them feel remarkably close and knowable despite being figures from the 19th century. Their story has been adapted and retold countless times in biographies, novels, plays, films, television series. Every generation rediscovers Victoria and Albert and reinterprets their relationship through the lens of contemporary values and concerns. Sometimes they're portrayed as romantic heroes. Sometimes they're portrayed as flawed people trying their best in difficult circumstances. Sometimes the focus is on their love story, sometimes on their parenting failures, sometimes on their political influence. The fact that their story remains interesting and relevant enough to keep being retold suggests that something about their relationship speaks to enduring human concerns about love, power, partnership, duty, and loss. The British monarchy itself is part of their legacy. The institution survived into the 21st century partly because Victoria and Albert modernised it, made it respectable, gave it a purpose beyond just existing as a relic of the past. The current British royal family is descended directly from Victoria and Albert through multiple lines. Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned from 1952 to 2022, was Victoria's great-great-granddaughter. King Charles III, the current monarch, is Victoria's great-great-great-grandson. When we see the British royal family today, we're looking at Victoria and Albert's descendants still carrying on the institution they helped reshape. The questions Victoria and Albert grappled with about how to balance public duty with private life, how to maintain relevant while adapting to changing times, how to use power responsibly, these are questions that modern royals still face. The difference is that Victoria and Albert were figuring it out without any real template to follow. They were improvising, making mistakes, sometimes getting it right and sometimes causing damage they didn't fully understand. But they were genuinely trying to do good work, to make the monarchy matter in positive ways, to use their position to improve society. That attempt, however imperfect its execution, set a standard for what constitutional monarchy could be in the modern world. There's something almost poignant about how much effort Victoria put into preserving Albert's legacy, building monuments and publishing his works and telling everyone who would listen about how brilliant he was, because in the end he's remembered. Primarily as her husband. He was Prince Albert, Victoria's consort, the man who married the Queen. His individual achievements matter to historians and specialists, but in popular consciousness he's defined by his relationship to Victoria. She wanted him to be remembered as a great reformer and visionary in his own right, and he was those things. But the most powerful part of his legacy is the love story he shared with her. The partnership they built together is more memorable than any individual project either of them completed. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the greatest thing Victoria and Albert accomplished wasn't the Great Exhibition or military reform or any specific policy change. Maybe it was proving that it was possible to build a genuine partnership based on love and respect even in the most public, most pressure-filled circumstances imaginable. They showed that vulnerability and intimacy weren't incompatible with power and duty. They demonstrated that you could be authentic in your relationships even when those relationships were being observed and judged by an entire empire. That's a lesson that resonates beyond the specific historical context of Victorian Britain. Their story also reminds us that love alone isn't enough to prevent damage or solve all problems. They loved each other deeply and genuinely, but they still made terrible decisions as parents that hurt their children. They were devoted partners, but their relationship was built on a level of dependence that became unhealthy and made Albert's death devastating in ways that more balanced relationships might not have been. Love is powerful and important, but it needs to exist alongside other things like independence and healthy boundaries and self-awareness. Victoria and Albert's relationship was remarkable but also flawed, which makes it more interesting and more human than a fairy tale version would be. The final question is whether Victoria was right when she insisted that their love never died. In a literal sense, obviously love dies with the people who feel it. Albert was dead, his consciousness was gone. Whatever he'd felt for Victoria ceased to exist when his brain stopped functioning. Victoria's love for Albert persisted, but it was increasingly a love for memory and ideal rather than the actual complicated person Albert had been. The Albert she mourned for 40 years was partly real and partly her own construction. The perfect prince who could never disappoint her because he was safely dead and couldn't contradict her version of him. But in a broader sense, Victoria was right. Their love story didn't die because we're still talking about it. We're still moved by it. We're still interested in it. Their relationship influences how we think about marriage and partnership, and the possibility of combining love with duty. The physical monuments Victoria built for Albert are still standing. The institutions Albert created are still functioning. Their descendants are still relevant in various ways, and their story, the narrative of two people who found each other despite difficult beginnings, and built something remarkable together that's still being told. That's a kind of immortality, even if it's not the kind either of them imagined. Victoria spent 40 years trying to make Albert immortal through memory and memorial. She succeeded, but not quite in the way she intended. Albert is remembered, but he's remembered primarily as part of their partnership, as Victoria's great love, as the man who helped her become a better queen. He's immortal as part of their story, not separate from it. And Victoria herself is remembered partly for her achievements as Britain's longest reigning monarch, until Elizabeth II, but also for the extraordinary grief that defined the second half of her reign. They're immortal together, which seems appropriate given how completely their lives were intertwined. So here we are, more than a century after they both died, still talking about them, still finding their story relevant and moving and complicated. They were people who lived specific lives in specific historical circumstances, but something about their relationship transcends those circumstances and speaks to universal human experiences. Love, loss, partnership, grief, duty, the struggle to balance personal happiness with public responsibility, these are themes that don't have expiration dates. Victoria and Albert's specific answers to these challenges might not be replicable or even desirable, but the questions they grappled with are still our questions. That's why their legacy survives. Not because of the monuments or the museums or the descendants scattered across European royal families, but because they lived a love story that was messy and genuine and profound enough that we're still trying to understand it 160 years later. The empire they ruled is gone. The certainties of the Victorian age are long past. The world has changed in ways they couldn't have imagined. But love, partnership, loss, grief, the human experiences they lived through and documented so thoroughly, those remain recognisable and relevant. Victoria and Albert's legacy isn't just the physical monuments or cultural traditions or political consequences. It's the proof that people in power can genuinely love each other, that duty and affection can coexist, that it's possible to be both vulnerable and strong, both human and extraordinary. That's a legacy worth preserving, worth talking about, worth remembering. And as long as we keep telling their story, Victoria's insistence that their love never died remains in its own way true. So there you have it. The story of Victoria and Albert, from two lonely kids in gilded cages to the greatest love story of the 19th century. A partnership that changed an empire, raised 9 children with mixed success, survived incredible pressures, and ended with Albert's death leaving Victoria to mourn for 4 decades. It's a story about love and loss, about power and vulnerability, about 2 people who found each other against the odds and built something remarkable together, even though both of them were damaged and flawed and sometimes terrible at being parents, or dealing with their emotions in healthy ways. They were extraordinary and ordinary, royal and human, impressive and frustrating. Just like all of us, really, except they had palaces and empires and enough documentation of their lives that we can still analyse their relationship more than a century later. Their love may have been complicated and sometimes unhealthy in its intensity, but it was undeniably real, and in the end, maybe that's what matters most. Not whether they were perfect, but that they tried to build something meaningful together and mostly succeeded despite all the obstacles. Not whether their choices were always wise, but that they faced impossible situations and did their best. Not whether we'd want to replicate their relationship exactly, but that we can learn something from both their successes and their failures. Victoria and Albert lived, loved, lost, and left behind a legacy that outlasted the empire they helped rule. That's worth talking about. That's worth remembering. That's worth one more night of staying up thinking about 2 people who died more than a century ago, but whose story still has the power to move us. So thanks for joining me on this journey through their lives and relationship. I hope you learned something, felt something, maybe saw something familiar in these 2 people from another era who struggled with questions we're still asking ourselves. And now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is for you, it's time to let go of Victoria and Albert for tonight and get some rest. Good night, everyone. Sweet dreams. May your own love stories, whatever form they take, be as genuine and profound as the one we've been exploring tonight, but maybe with slightly healthier boundaries and fewer preserved rooms full of hot water for dead people. Sleep well.